Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we sink into lace, lavender sachets, and a few grimy secrets beneath those high-button collars. Picture this: a parlour dimly lit by gaslight, the smell of beeswax polish in the air, a clock ticking steadily, while a genteel lady sips weak tea and dreams of Paris. But behind the poise and porcelain, Victorian women were silently managing an awkward ballet of corsets, calendars and chamber pots. And they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The corset is more than a garment. It's a symbol of the Victorian woman, cinched tightly at the waist, stiff with whalebone or steel and wrapped in silent expectations. What's often glossed over in history class, however, is the digestive mayhem those fashionable little contraptions caused. A lady might look serene while embroidering a handkerchief, but underneath her layers she was often battling a war of bloating, cramps, and, yes, constipation. Corsets squeeze the abdomen upward and inward, jostling organs into unfamiliar arrangements. Imagine your stomach suddenly crammed into a space the size of a teacup. Food doesn't exactly rush through under those conditions. Victorian physicians, men of course, blamed women's delicate constitutions for their sluggish bowels. But behind the veil of modesty and euphemisms like irregularity, there was a growing pile of dried plums and senna tea quietly prescribed. And when all else failed, enemas. Oh yes. The Victorian enema was a regular household item complete with pewter syringes and reusable nozzles. It wasn't just a medical tool. It was an unspoken ritual, kept discreetly in a lady's washstand drawer beside her rosewater tonic and smelling salts. One popular 19th century advice book warned young women that constriction of the garments, especially around the abdomen, impedes the normal peristaltic motion. Translation: take off that corset before your intestines give up. Historians still argue whether corsets truly deformed internal organs, or if the dramatic illustrations were just Victorian-era propaganda. But personal diaries and medical notes do point to chronic discomfort, bloating, indigestion, and a surprisingly high interest in laxatives. And speaking of discomfort, how about using the bathroom when you're laced into a corset covered in layers of petticoats, drawers, and maybe a crinoline or bustle? Going to the toilet wasn't just a bodily function, it was a logistical puzzle. Women often had to untie or partially unhook their corsets just to sit down. Not exactly a quick stop. Enter the chamber pot. These ceramic or tin basins, painted with delicate florals or dainty gold trim, lived under the bed or inside a nightstand. Elegant? Yes. But at 2 a.m, they were about as charming as a leaky faucet. Victorian women used them discreetly, and in well-off households maids were tasked with emptying them each morning. But let's not pretend this was a seamless system. If a woman was staying in a busy townhouse or travelling without a personal servant, she might have to carry her own chamber pot to a shared disposal area. Imagine balancing that while trying not to trip on your nightgown or brush against the wallpaper. That's why many chamber pots came with lids, and tight ones. One particularly odd solution was the slipper pot, a low flat pot shaped to resemble a shoe, meant for subtle use under skirts. It's like the Victorian version of stealth mode. Despite all this, women rarely spoke of their toilet routines. Instead, euphemisms did the heavy lifting. One might excuse herself to attend to personal matters or refresh her toilette, all while clutching her skirts and making a discreet beeline to the pot. We might chuckle now, but it wasn't funny when things went wrong. A tightly corseted body plus weak pelvic muscles often led to urinary retention, infections, or worse. But shame ruled supreme. So instead of asking a doctor, many women relied on folk remedies, or those mysterious concoctions advertised in the back of ladies' magazines. The ladies' friend elixirs promised monthly relief and bodily harmony, but some were basically opium in syrup form. Spoiler alert, they didn't help digestion. Meanwhile, clothing design offered little relief. Though women wore split-crotch drawers, yes, really, the open seam wasn't exactly liberating. It allowed for toilet use without undressing completely, but that also meant navigating your business with layers of fabric draped around your knees. The acrobatics involved. Impressive, really. In polite society, this entire bodily ecosystem was shrouded in silence. A young lady might be trained in piano, French, and embroidery, but she was never taught how to talk about her bathroom habits. Those were managed in private, often with whispered advice from older sisters or nurses. "Keep regular, dear," was the code phrase for eat prunes and say a prayer. Of course, the more well-to-do a woman was, the more layers she had to wrangle, and the less likely she was to actually move throughout her day. Physical inactivity didn't exactly help things flow, so the upper crust sat elegantly in their parlours, sipping diluted wine and fidgeting through mild digestive distress, while their bowels made passive-aggressive complaints. The working-class woman, on the other hand, had other issues. While she might not wear corsets as tight or layers as thick, she often lacked any privacy. Shared tenement bathrooms, open-air privies, or even outhouses at the edge of a muddy yard were the norm. No perfumed potpourri here, just rough weather, neighbours too close, and little time for dainty rituals. Interestingly, some social reformers began linking women's digestion to their morality. A healthy bowel, they argued, meant a healthy mind and soul. One infamous 19th century doctor insisted that irregular bowels were the root of female hysteria and melancholy. Never mind the corsets, the repression, or the lack of plumbing. Clearly it was all about fibre. Still, beneath the ridiculousness, there's something oddly tender about these forgotten routines. The porcelain pot lovingly painted with roses, the ritual of sipping a senna brew by candlelight, the secret notes passed between sisters recommending lemon water or licorice root. In a world so tightly wound with rules, even digestion had its own etiquette. And in this strange tangle of modesty and misalignment, of floral chamber pots and constipation-inducing fashion, the Victorian woman managed to carry herself with quiet dignity. Mostly. Unless the prune juice kicked in during tea, while corsets may have pinched internal organs and slowed digestion to a lazy crawl, the moment of release, when nature called, offered no relief from Victorian decorum. Welcome to the curious ballet of the chamber pot shuffle, a nightly waltz carried out in candlelight and silence. Picture a grand Victorian bedroom with velvet drapes, embroidered pillows, and perhaps a few sentimental daguerreotypes staring solemnly from a dresser. Hidden beneath this prim scene sits a humble porcelain pot, unglamorous yet essential. In the absence of indoor plumbing for much of the 19th century, women relied on these chamber pots for nighttime necessities. A lady might wake in the middle of the night, feel the call of nature, and begin the careful descent from her high mattress, usually by candlelight, lest she step on a loose floorboard and wake the entire household. The first challenge? Layers, nightgowns, petticoats, sometimes even light corsetry worn to sleep. These had to be lifted or arranged with the precision of a seasoned contortionist. Then came the actual manoeuvring, balancing above or squatting over the pot without tipping it, which required both core strength and blind trust. Some women used wooden toilet chairs with pots hidden underneath the seat, a kind of Victorian commode. These provided a bit more stability, but were usually reserved for wealthier homes or older women. For most, the chamber pot remained the standard. By morning, the pot had to be emptied. In middle and upper-class homes, this fell to the chambermaid, who would carry the contents discreetly to a scullery or outdoor disposal point. But in households without staff, this task fell to the lady of the house or her daughters. A rather unromantic way to begin the day, emptying last night's evidence into a larger waste container, often referred to as a slop bucket, which might later be dumped into a cesspool or, if you were unlucky, straight into the gutter. And yes, the stench could be dreadful. That's why pot lids were common, and why many women kept sachets of lavender or camphor nearby, dabbing them to their nose before undertaking the unpleasant task. One popular ladies' magazine suggested soaking the chamber pot in vinegar once a week to keep odours at bay. Not exactly spa treatment, but it helped. In more rural areas, women might rely on outdoor privies, tiny wooden huts at the edge of the garden, often cold, spider-infested, and surrounded by night sounds that made the imagination run wild. Venturing out there in a long flannel nightgown, holding a flickering lantern and hoping not to trip over a root, not exactly the stuff of Jane Austen romance, and yet there were moments of ingenuity. Some pots were designed with handles for easier carrying, others were built into discreet wooden boxes to resemble stools or footrests, making them blend seamlessly into the room's decor. One surviving pot from a wealthy household was shaped like a swan, complete with a painted beak on the lid, a strange mix of elegance and practicality. Then there were the travel scenarios. A Victorian woman on the move had to contend with long carriage rides, train journeys and rest stops that rarely included anything resembling a bathroom. That's where the ladies' urinal came in. A small portable device made of tin or ceramic, shaped to fit discreetly under skirts. These were not exactly comfortable, but they provided some measure of dignity in otherwise dire situations. The real challenge, however, was silence. A Victorian woman was expected to be modest in all things, including bodily functions. No discussion of needing to go, no audible sounds, and certainly no complaints. That meant every nighttime shuffle and every creaky pot lid had to be managed with the grace of a ballerina and the stealth of a cat burglar. Some women even tried to time their needs around the presence of servants or family members, holding it in until they could find a moment alone. This, of course, led to bladder infections and other health issues, but modesty came first. Victorian etiquette books warned against any unclean displays and encouraged retiring from company discreetly, even within the home. And speaking of etiquette, there were rules for chamber pots. Ladies were instructed never to empty them in view of male family members. Maids were to carry them covered, preferably wrapped in a towel or concealed inside a basin. And heaven forbid someone should drop one down the stairs, an event both mortifying and, depending on the contents, possibly catastrophic. Still, chamber pots became oddly personalised objects. Some were plain and utilitarian, others painted with delicate blue florals or adorned with cheeky slogans. One surviving example, likely belonging to a more rebellious household, bears the phrase, "Go before you sleep," in looping script around the rim. Another from a well-to-do family in London was custom monogrammed in gold. In the absence of plumbing, these pots did the heavy lifting day after day. They were carried across icy hallways, balanced on hip bones, hidden behind curtains, and scrubbed by hand. It's a part of history that rarely gets mentioned, even though every woman, aristocrat or servant, had to deal with it in one way or another. Of course, not everyone used them with the same frequency. Older women, pregnant women, and anyone with a weak bladder might rely on them multiple times a night. That's why larger pots, sometimes called slop jars, were kept in some households, less dainty, more practical. Or there's also a touch of romantic tragedy in it all. Think of the unmarried woman who lives with her sister, the ageing spinster who carries her pot alone to the garden at dawn, or the young wife, newly arrived in her husband's home, trying not to make a sound as she uses the pot for the first time. These were intimate, deeply personal acts carried out in the shadows of propriety. Historians still argue whether Victorian women felt burdened or simply accepted these routines as the norm. In the absence of comparison, perhaps the daily shuffle to the chamber pot seemed no more troublesome than brushing one's hair or lacing a boot. But judging by the number of jokes, euphemisms and subtle complaints in diaries and letters, it seems safe to say that very few found joy in the process. One woman wrote in her journal in 1874, "I dread the winter mornings when I must carry the pot across the frost. The handle burns like ice, and still, mother says I must not speak of it." There's a kind of haunting quiet to that line, both in the physical chill and the silence imposed by social expectations. And yet, some moments of levity did break through. Children naturally found chamber pots hilarious, and many households had smaller versions for the little ones, often brightly painted or shaped like animals. One London museum even houses a child's pot in the shape of a frog, complete with wide eyes and a slightly suspicious expression. Servants, too, had their own internal jokes. A housemaid might nickname the chamber pot she carried every day, or swap horror stories of spills and smells with other maids on their rare breaks. In many ways, these women saw more of their employers' private habits than anyone else. They were the silent witnesses to the unseen labour of womanhood, the backaches, the careful balancing, the necessity of routine. And for every ornate dressing table with pearl-handled brushes, there was likely a chamber pot tucked just beneath it, waiting quietly for its moment in the dark. If the chamber pot was a staple of middle-class and working-class life, then the water closet, the Victorian forerunner of the modern bathroom, was the elusive unicorn of upper-class households. These early flush toilets were rare, expensive, and at times hilariously unreliable, but if you had one in your home, it was an unmistakable symbol of prestige. Nothing whispered, "We've made it," quite like a pipe that carried your business out of the house, and somewhere, anywhere, else. The phrase water closet actually originated in the 18th century, but it wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that these marvels of sanitation began appearing in more upscale British homes. These early models were complicated contraptions with levers, tanks, pull chains, and a frequent tendency to either explode with water or more awkwardly not flush at all. One famous example, the valve closet designed by Thomas Crapper, yes, that's his real name, became a favourite among the wealthy, partly due to clever marketing and partly because it actually worked most of the time. Contrary to popular myth, Crapper didn't invent the toilet, but he did improve and popularise it, installing water closets in royal residences and luxury townhomes across London. In the most elite homes, the water closet was located near the bedrooms or dressing rooms, usually tucked away behind a discreet door or screen. It might feature wood-panelled walls, a small window, often nailed shut, and a pull-chain cistern mounted high above the bowl, with a long brass chain dangling like a ceremonial tassel. Of course, there was still no such thing as indoor plumbing as we know it today. Water had to be pumped into storage tanks, gravity-fed down to the closet, and waste was flushed, ideally, into a cesspit or sewer. In neighbourhoods without proper drainage, that sewage could back up spectacularly, leading to what contemporary newspapers politely referred to as foul effusions. Even so, the novelty was irresistible. Queen Victoria's palaces boasted early water closets, and upper-class women spoke of them in euphemistic admiration. So convenient, one lady wrote to her cousin, and perfectly private. Private, yes, until the plumbing failed, and it often did. Poor seals, leaky valves, or over-enthusiastic flushing could cause indoor flooding that turned a morning toilette into a mop-worthy disaster. In fact, some homes employed full-time closet maids, whose sole task was to keep these machines clean and functional. For the average Victorian woman, entering a water closet felt like stepping into a modern marvel. There were tiles on the floor, polished brass fittings, and sometimes even a small sink or mirror. It was a moment of solitude wrapped in an aura of upper-class luxury. However, using one was not always intuitive. Etiquette manuals began publishing instructions for the proper operation of a water closet. Always pull the chain with a steady hand, advised one 1872 guide, and never linger needlessly as other ladies may be waiting. Because yes, early water closets were sometimes communal within a household, one closet shared by many. If you were lucky, there might be a second near the servants' quarters. This didn't always sit well with Victorian ideals of privacy. Some women complained of hearing others flush, or worse, being heard themselves. To combat this, they'd wait until a piano was played downstairs or a carriage passed outside before pulling the chain. And those with real paranoia, they'd hum loudly or cough at strategic moments, all to cloak the dreadful sound of flushing. Historians still debate whether women truly preferred these new inventions over the familiar chamber pot. Some certainly appreciated the convenience, but others found the whole mechanism unsettling. Early water closets could gurgle, clank, or even send up mysterious smells if improperly installed. Imagine settling into the moment, only to hear a noise that sounded suspiciously like a pipe groaning in protest. It didn't help that plumbers were still figuring things out. In one infamous case from 1868, a misconnected waste pipe sent raw sewage into a home's water supply. The lady of the house, it's rumoured, fainted on the spot. Still, water closets were fashionable. A well-appointed dressing room might feature a closet hidden behind an ornate curtain, flanked by lavender sachets and lace-trimmed shelves. Some wealthy women commissioned custom toilet seats with velvet cushions, not exactly hygienic, but decadently soft. One even had her initials embroidered into the toilet's fabric cover, because nothing says refinement like monogrammed plumbing. And yet, beneath all the luxury was the lingering question of maintenance. Servants were expected to clean these devices daily, using buckets of water, lemon juice, and carbolic acid. The smell was fierce, and many maids wore scarves over their mouths during the task. More than one diary entry from the period mentions a maid falling ill from the fumes. The working classes, watching all this from afar, could only dream of such conveniences. For most of the Victorian era, they continued using outdoor privies or chamber pots. Water closets were a curiosity, something seen in shop windows or advertised in newspapers with headlines like, "The future of sanitation, today." Still, public water closets began to appear in cities, though access for women remained limited. In 1851, the Great Exhibition in London showcased one of the first public flushing toilets, designed for ladies. it cost a penny to use, a fee that led to the expression to spend a penny. Women lined up out of curiosity, modesty clashing with marvel. For many it was the first time they'd seen such a thing, and not everyone was impressed. One woman was reportedly frightened by the rushing sound, while another refused to sit, choosing instead to hover awkwardly and leave early. Even in the wealthiest homes, embarrassment still loomed. One countess famously ordered that her water closet be installed in a closet within a closet, behind a locked door and screened by a velvet partition. She kept a bell beside her dressing table to summon a maid to run water through the pipes before and after she used it, so she wouldn't hear or smell a thing. Meanwhile, architects began to design dedicated bathroom suites in the larger homes. These included a water closet, a bathtub, and sometimes a bidet, imported from France and treated with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Victorian prudery extended to plumbing. Some women reportedly refused to sit on the toilet directly, layering the seat with a folded towel or piece of muslin. Others limited themselves to a single flush per day, fearing the device might wear out or cause unexpected flooding. And as strange as it sounds, there was even a movement to make water closets beautiful. Manufacturers began designing decorative porcelain bowls, often painted with florals or Grecian motifs. Some had wooden seats with carved flourishes, others came with matching footrests, because apparently even the throne required accessories. Of course, not everyone approved. Some moral reformers warned that water closets encouraged laziness and immodesty. They feared young women might spend too long alone in such private spaces, becoming self-absorbed. One pamphlet darkly warned against overindulgence in the comfort of indoor privation. Still, progress marched on, pipe by pipe. As cities expanded and municipal sewer systems improved, water closets trickled quite literally into more homes. What began as a luxury slowly became an expectation. But for the women who lived through that transitional period, the water closet was a strange mixture of marvel and menace, convenience and concern. And though its plumbing may have clanged and its odours occasionally misbehaved, the Victorian water closet symbolised something deeper, a glimpse into a future where even the most private routines could be touched by innovation. If corsets were difficult and water closets unpredictable, then nothing in the Victorian woman's bathroom experience was quite as taboo, or as quietly misunderstood, as managing her monthly cycle. It was a topic so cloaked in euphemism and silence that many girls reached puberty having no idea what was happening to them. The moment of first menstruation could arrive not with understanding, but with terror. Victorian girls were often shielded from knowledge about their own bodies. Mothers, governesses, and teachers rarely addressed menstruation directly. When they did, it was often with hushed tones and evasive phrases like "your monthly visitor" or "nature's burden." The result? A generation of women raised to believe that menstruation was both shameful and unmentionable, something to conceal at all costs. So when the time came, young women were handed rudimentary supplies and a few whispered instructions. These supplies, often handmade, might include strips of flannel or linen sewn into absorbent pads. These were held in place by homemade belts, fabric or elastic straps worn around the waist with little hooks or buttons to attach the pad. They weren't especially comfortable, and certainly not reliable. Leaks were common, especially since disposable options wouldn't emerge until well into the next century. This setup required daily washing. Used pads were soaked in cold water, scrubbed by hand, often in private, and dried discreetly behind a stove or in an airing cupboard. Servants or younger sisters were often roped into the task, creating a small, hidden ecosystem of labour centred around the most silenced of bodily functions. One upper-middle-class woman from Yorkshire recalled her mother handing her a small flannel bundle and saying simply, "This is yours now. Mind you wash it quietly." That was the extent of her education. There was no ibuprofen to ease cramps, no heat packs, and no one openly acknowledging that this might be a painful, even debilitating experience. Instead, women turned to folk remedies: chamomile tea, warm bricks placed near the abdomen, and, if they could afford it, a dose of laudanum. That last one, an opium-based tincture, was shockingly common. It dulled the pain, and dulled everything else too. Doctors, predictably, had all manner of misguided theories. Some believed that menstruation was a form of internal cleansing, necessary to purge the female body of excess emotion and energy. Others warned that too much mental stimulation during one's period, like reading or writing, could lead to hysteria or infertility. One medical text earnestly stated that women should rest in bed and avoid all excitable company during their menses. Excitable company in this case meant everything from flirtatious conversation to a particularly energetic game of charades. And yet, Victorian women were expected to carry on. Dances, dinners, housework, it all continued, with no excuse considered valid for withdrawal. Even fainting from menstrual pain was brushed off as delicate nerves. One might be offered a cordial or smelling salts, but certainly not understanding. Historians still argue whether these social silences made women more stoic or simply more resigned. Diaries from the era show both. Quiet suffering described in veiled language, and occasional small rebellions where a woman might refuse an invitation with the simple excuse of being indisposed. Clothing, as always, did no one any favours. Managing menstruation in corsets, petticoats, drawers and long skirts meant that any accident was both highly visible and incredibly mortifying. Stories abound of young women dashing out of drawing rooms after discovering a stain, or being quietly escorted home from church after someone whispered a warning. There were no stain-removing pens or backup garments. The solution? Wrap a shawl around your waist and walk with as much dignity as one could muster. In public spaces, the lack of bathrooms posed additional challenges. Women on long journeys often had no place to tend to their needs. On trains, one might wait for a ladies' compartment, but those were few and far between, and almost never equipped for changing sanitary cloths. Some women carried small bundles in their handbags, wrapped in muslin and tied with ribbon, to swap out when absolutely necessary. At home, girls were often warned not to bathe during menstruation, lest the water draw out the vitality. This old wives' tale persisted well into the 20th century and led to many women avoiding regular bathing during their periods, compounding already difficult hygiene. Yet despite all this discomfort, women found ways to care for one another. Sisters, close friends, or favoured maids might quietly share tips: which flannel soaked less, which herbs helped with pain, and how to dry pads without them stiffening into uncomfortable bricks. Some even stitched tiny decorative pouches to store their clean cloths, a strange blend of necessity and beauty. There were, of course, commercial efforts to solve the problem. By the late 1800s, companies began advertising menstrual belts and absorbent pads in women's magazines. These ads were often as coy as the society they served, referring to products as hygienic garments or discreet aids for monthly comfort. No mention of blood, no mention of the female body really, just diagrams of smiling women wearing bustles and high collars. But these products were expensive, and many women never saw them. Working-class women continued using whatever was available: old rags, wool scraps, even moss in some rural areas. Laundry was done in rivers or communal basins, often by hand and with little soap. Privacy was a luxury most could not afford. In some communities, menstruation was treated with quiet reverence. Among certain rural groups, girls were given a day of rest upon their first period and told stories of fertility and womanhood. But these were exceptions. More often, menstruation was associated with sin, uncleanliness, and even danger. Some churches barred menstruating women from taking communion, and one preacher warned that a woman in her monthly state should avoid pickling vegetables, lest she sour the brine with her touch. Yes, really. And so, menstruation became a secret choreography: carefully timed washing, discreet carrying of cloths, unspoken cues between women. It shaped their daily routines, their social calendars, and their sense of self, all while being officially ignored by nearly every institution in their lives. The impact was profound. Victorian women often described feeling ashamed of their own nature, or divided from the world once a month. And yet they endured. Some even found moments of solidarity. One letter between two sisters, preserved in a museum archive, reads, "Dear Em, I am wearing the striped flannel today, and wish I could stay in bed with you. Mama says we mustn't speak of it, but I know you understand." And that's the heart of it. In the face of silence, women created their own whisper networks of knowledge, their own rituals of care, and their own inner strength. Though their bodies were rarely understood by the men who governed their lives, they learned to manage them with resilience and grace. As if corsets, chamber pots, and monthly silence weren't enough, the Victorian woman had yet another intimate dilemma to contend with: toilet paper, or rather, the conspicuous absence of it. Long before the advent of soft quilted rolls stacked neatly in modern bathrooms, Victorian ladies had to get creative when cleaning up after their most private moments. And believe me, those solutions range from mildly unpleasant to absolutely baffling. To start with, many households, especially in rural or working class settings, didn't use any product resembling toilet paper at all. Instead, they relied on whatever was readily available. Newspaper, catalogue pages, or scraps of linen were common choices. The famously thick and glossy pages of the Sears Roebuck catalogue weren't just for shopping. They had a second, decidedly more utilitarian life hanging on a nail in the outhouse. But these were not exactly gentle on the skin. Anyone who's ever tried using anything glossier than a paper towel in a desperate moment knows the friction involved. Yet, necessity doesn't ask for comfort, especially when dealing with basic hygiene in an era where plumbing and privacy were still considered luxuries. In rural communities, nature itself often stepped in as the provider. Leaves, grass, and even handfuls of moss were used, soft, absorbent, and, if you weren't paying attention, possibly embedded with ants. The slightly more terrifying alternative? Corn husks. Yes, you heard that right. Dried corn husks were actually quite popular in American households, including among those of English descent living in the countryside. They were durable, easy to come by, and surprisingly effective. That said, you had to soften them up first by running them through your hands repeatedly, or soaking them briefly in water. Otherwise, using a raw corn husk on your nether regions could best be described as agriculturally aggressive. In wealthier homes, things were only marginally more refined. Some families used squares of cloth, which were cleaned and reused much like menstrual cloths. Others ordered specialty papers from pharmacists, slightly softer sheets packaged in boxes, more like napkins than the rolls we know today. These early commercial papers were marketed as medicated or hygienic, and came in dry, stiff little rectangles that made today's single ply look like a cashmere sweater. In fact, the first mass-produced toilet paper wasn't even sold on a roll. That innovation wouldn't become common until the 20th century. In Victorian England, papers were individually stacked in boxes and offered with proud names like Gobble's patent paper or the Comfort wipe, suggesting more confidence than comfort. And let's just say, these were not the height of plush indulgence. One such product, known as Bronco paper, was famously described as medicated sandpaper. It got the job done, but you were going to feel it. In households where servants attended to cleaning and washing, the matter of reusable cloths added a layer of class complexity. It was typically the maid's job to launder these squares along with other undergarments and menstrual supplies. There were entire cleaning routines built around boiling, rinsing and drying sanitary cloths, and despite the intimate nature of the work, it was considered simply another part of domestic service. Historians still debate how widespread commercial toilet paper really was in Victorian England. Some believe it remained a rare luxury item, largely confined to the urban elite. Others argue that by the late 19th century it was making quiet inroads into the middle class, used alongside more traditional methods like rags or catalogue pages. What is clear, though, is that cleanliness was a source of anxiety. Victorians were obsessed with hygiene, at least in theory. Cleanliness was considered not just a bodily virtue, but a moral one. To be dirty was to be suspect spiritually and socially. And so women, who were expected to maintain not only their own hygiene but that of their household, were placed under tremendous pressure to ensure spotless, unscented respectability, even without modern tools. This often meant using perfumed cloths or splashing diluted vinegar as a final rinse. Some women mixed rosewater or alum into their cleaning solutions, hoping to mask any hint of natural odour. In medical circles, a growing trend toward feminine hygiene began to appear, though these early efforts were often more dangerous than helpful. One popular cleansing tonic included borax and carbolic acid. Fresh? Sure. Safe? Absolutely not. And then there was the matter of disposal. Used cloths had to be soaked and scrubbed, not only to prevent staining but to avoid any evidence being visible to others in the household. In some homes, these cloths were hidden in special drawers or sealed ceramic jars until they could be laundered, out of sight, out of mind. For women on the move, things got trickier. Travelling by carriage or train didn't exactly lend itself to privacy. Many women carried small sachets filled with herbs or potpourri, both to disguise any lingering odours on their person and to refresh their hands or undergarments with a quick swipe. If a woman needed to relieve herself during a journey, She might step behind a bush with her handkerchief in one hand and a strip of cloth in the other, praying no one passed by. And speaking of handkerchiefs, yes, sometimes they were used. Not the embroidered ones for show, of course, but older, worn-out ones found a second life. Given the fabric's softness and size, it was arguably one of the more practical solutions, though it certainly changed how you looked at someone dabbing politely at their nose. Even in urban homes, outhouses and backyard privies remained common until the last decades of the century. These required constant maintenance, especially in cities where disease could spread rapidly. Some reformers, particularly women, campaigned for better sanitation infrastructure, arguing that access to clean, safe facilities was not only a public health issue but a matter of dignity. Still, embarrassment lingered. Toilet habits were never discussed openly, and Victorian advice books never ever acknowledged the nitty-gritty of wiping. Instead, they focused on euphemisms: proper ablution, intimate attention, ladies' cleansing regimen. It was all very polite and very opaque. One fringe theory, delightfully odd and wholly unproven, claimed that Queen Victoria herself used only silk cloths, perfumed and imported from France. While there's no solid evidence of this, the rumour persisted, fuelled by the notion that someone of such royal bearing must have found a way to make even toilet time elegant. But for the average Victorian woman, there was nothing glamorous about the experience. The lack of reliable toilet paper was a daily nuisance, one rarely spoken of and yet entirely universal. In every house, from the grandest manor to the humblest cottage, women quietly did what they needed to do, folding cloth, softening husks, choosing the right page from a catalogue, and then carried on with their day. And perhaps that's the real story here, the silent resilience of routine. No matter how awkward the method or how primitive the tools, Victorian women met the demands of bodily function with ingenuity, grace, and often a slightly pained expression. And if you ever find yourself grumbling about a 2-ply roll running out, just remember, at least it's not a corn husk. Close your eyes and breathe in a Victorian parlour. Rosewater, beeswax, perhaps a hint of musty velvet. But behind all that genteel fragrance lurked a darker truth. The Victorian world stank, not just of unwashed bodies or coal smoke, but of chamber pots, privies, and damp laundry drying in hallways. So what did they do about it? They masked it. Aggressively. Welcome to the perfume problem. In a time before daily showers and roll-on deodorant, scent was survival. Victorian women practically marinated themselves in perfumes, scented powders, sachets, and floral waters. Lavender, rose, violet, and bergamot weren't just fashion choices. They were defences against the human condition. Smelling good was a social requirement and a moral imperative. Cleanliness, after all, was next to godliness, and when soap and water were limited, a bottle of eau de cologne became the next best thing. But here's the catch. Bathing was infrequent. Many women, even those in wealthy households, only bathed once a week, if that. Full immersion tubs were a luxury, and the water had to be heated manually, bucket by bucket. So to fill the gap, they dusted themselves with powders made of starch, chalk, and crushed orris root. These powders helped soak up oil and sweat, leaving behind a floral scent and a slightly ghostly pallor. Perfumed handkerchiefs were essential accessories. Tucked up sleeves, into gloves, or behind corset stays, they offered a discreet way to mask unpleasant odours, yours or someone else's. It was entirely acceptable for a woman to gently dab her handkerchief to her nose when walking past a fishmonger, a coal cart, or a neighbour's less-than-sanitary alleyway. That dainty sniff wasn't about being delicate, it was strategic. Meanwhile, the home itself required daily olfactory defence. Potpourri bowls filled with dried petals and herbs were placed on mantels and chamber stands. Some women sewed tiny sachets of dried lavender or rosemary and stuffed them into drawers, between petticoats, and even into their bustles. Yes, the bustle. Home of hidden fragrance and on less fortunate days trapped heat and sweat. One of the more bizarre trends? Scented wallpaper. By the 1880s, manufacturers were producing wallpapers infused with floral oils. These papers released faint aromas as the room warmed, like a very slow and rather expensive air freshener. Unfortunately, they also released arsenic. That's right. Many of these wallpapers used green pigments containing arsenic compounds. As they decayed, they released toxic dust. So while your sitting room may have smelled faintly of violets, it might also have slowly poisoned you. a minor detail, there were more personal dangers too. Victorian perfumes often included alcohol, essential oils, and sometimes outright hazardous substances. Musk and civet, animal-based scents, were popular among the elite, though acquiring them involved processes that were, shall we say, unkind to the animals involved. One popular fragrance included ambergris, a waxy substance found in the intestines of sperm whales. Romantic, only if you don't think too hard about it. And then there were the mysterious concoctions advertised in women's magazines and sold in apothecaries under names like Madame Bellamy's Parisian Charm, Bouquet de Lily, or Mistress Elmira's Evening Tincture. These mixtures promised to mask sweat, seduce suitors, and prevent faint air. Some actually smelled pleasant. Others smelled like mouldy cinnamon with a side of regret. The fear of body odour ran deep. Etiquette books warned against natural exhalations and advised women to discreetly cleanse under the arms and between the limbs with cloth soaked in rosewater. But in a world where full baths were rare and deodorants didn't yet exist, many women relied on a rotating cast of powders, scents, and wishful thinking. Historians still argue over how bad the Victorian era truly smelled. Some suggest we overestimate the stench, romanticising our own modern hygiene. Others point to letters and diaries filled with complaints about the fetid air, unpleasant bodily warmth, and the sheer intensity of summer crowds in corsets. One Londoner described the experience of walking through a crowd as like pushing through a fog of human stew. Inside homes, the problem intensified. Coal fires added smoke, chamber pots added ammonia, and tightly sealed windows trapped everything in. The solution? More scent. Women would burn incense, light scented candles, or place orange peels on radiators. Even bed linens were sprinkled with lavender water between washes, a ritual often handled by maids who might not have been told what exactly they were scenting over. A fringe favourite: vinegar. Some women swore by vinegar washes, believing they neutralised odours and tightened the pores. A vinegar foot bath was even recommended for restoring feminine composure. Refreshing? Not exactly, but it beat the alternative. And what of the men? Surely they had their own fragrance foibles. Indeed, Victorian gentlemen doused themselves in cologne and bay rum, the latter a spicy concoction originally designed for sailors. But women had the tougher job. They were expected to smell delicate, not powerful, floral, not musky. A woman who overdid her perfume risked being labelled fast or vulgar. One etiquette guide snidely advised, "A proper lady's scent should not enter a room before she does." And yet plenty of women broke that rule with enthusiasm. The most fashionable women, actresses, artists, society rebels, wore heady blends of jasmine, neroli and patchouli. Some even concocted their own perfumes, blending oils at home like apothecaries with a flair for drama. Perfume was power. It was one of the few tools a Victorian woman had to express herself outside of words or clothes. If she couldn't say what she was feeling, perhaps she could wear a scent that whispered it. A whiff of orange blossom might say innocence, while sandalwood murmured mystery. Rosewater hinted at romance, but add a splash of vetiver, and it suggested something bolder, less ladylike. In the theatre of Victorian life, where emotions were muted and roles strictly defined, scent offered a secret language. Women wrote of spraying perfume onto love letters, dabbing it onto lace-trimmed gloves before a rendezvous, or misting it into their hair before bed. Even funerals had signature fragrances. Violet water was often used, thought to soothe grief and cleanse the soul. Yet for all its poetry, scent couldn't hide everything. In the dog days of summer, when corsets clung and drawers stuck, even the most floral bouquet struggled to compete with reality. No matter how many sachets you sewed into your waistband, the human body eventually made itself known. And this, perhaps more than anything, explains the Victorian obsession with control. Control of smell, control of appearance, control of even the faintest trace of the body's natural rhythms. Perfume was the mask, the armour, the final flourish that allowed a woman to step into society with her head high, her gloves spotless, and her scent so carefully curated that no one would ever guess she'd only bathed 2 days ago in a tepid hip tub filled by her maid. So next time you spritz on a bit of fragrance, think of the women who came before, armed with rosewater, laced with arsenic wallpaper, and bravely fighting back against the olfactory chaos of their world. one sachet at a time. Bathe once a week, if you were lucky. For most Victorian women, cleanliness was less about a steamy soak and more about a careful negotiation with limited resources, freezing water, and social expectations that left little room for honesty. Welcome to the tub time blues, Victorian style. Let's start with the basics. Full-body bathing wasn't the norm. It was aspirational. Indoor bathrooms were rare, especially outside of upper-class homes. Running hot water, practically mythical. The average woman, even one living in a reasonably well-to-do household, did not have a bathroom to herself, let alone one with a tub ready to go at a moment's notice. Baths had to be filled manually, one bucket at a time, often heated over a stove or fireplace and carried through narrow carpeted halls to a tin or porcelain tub in the kitchen or a chilly back room. So bathing became a production. It was loud, labour-intensive, and thoroughly inconvenient. It took at least an hour to get enough water hot, and that's if the household wasn't trying to economise on coal. By the time the tub was filled, the water had cooled considerably, and that was before anyone even stepped in. Many women simply didn't bother with full immersion more than once a week, if that. Instead, they practised partial ablutions, which is Victorian for sponge baths. Every morning a woman might wash her face, neck, armpits and hands with a small basin of water and a cloth. The rest was left to chance, scent, and a lot of tightly woven cotton undergarments. Soap was another adventure. Not the silky, moisturising bars we know today, but hard, scratchy blocks made of animal fat and lye. Many soaps were scented with lavender or rose, but beneath the perfume was the unmistakable bite of alkali. It cleaned, yes, but it also stripped. Skin became dry, red, even cracked in winter. So women often followed their wash with cold cream or oil, if they could afford it. Hair washing, that was an ordeal unto itself, and one we'll return to later. For now, just know it was rare. Most women cleaned their scalps with brushes and powders and left the full rinse for special occasions, or not at all. But for those few who did climb into the tub each week, the experience was hardly relaxing. Baths were short, 5, maybe 10 minutes, and you shared the water with your entire household. That's right. In many families, the same tub water was reused in sequence, often starting with the father, then the mother, and working down through the children. By the time it got to the youngest, the water was murky and lukewarm at best. Luxurious? Not quite. To improve the experience, some women added herbs or vinegar to the water. Rose petals were lovely but impractical. More common were sprigs of lavender, handfuls of oatmeal tied in muslin bags, or even salt. Not to soften the skin, though it sometimes helped, but to mask the smell of old metal tubs and stagnant water. Drying off was another ordeal. Towels were usually thin and coarse, and since homes didn't have radiators or heated rails, they were often cold and slightly damp from the last use. But the alternative, air drying in a chilly room, was unthinkable. So women rubbed briskly, redressed quickly, and tried not to think about it. Public baths offered a communal solution for those without facilities at home. In cities like London and Manchester, bathhouses opened in the mid-19th century, often funded by social reformers concerned about disease and sanitation. But public baths weren't always welcoming. The water wasn't always clean, privacy was minimal, and for women especially it could feel scandalously exposed. In some working-class districts, you paid a penny for access to a tub and a bar of soap. The attendant might help you carry your clothes to a small stall, where you'd bathe behind a curtain while listening to the muffled sounds of the woman in the next stall cursing the cold water. Not exactly spa day. And if you lived in a rural area, bathing might mean hauling buckets from a well, heating them over a hearth, and bathing in a wooden barrel or even a large metal washtub. These tubs were usually kept in kitchens or sculleries, the warmest rooms in the house. And because this was a communal space, timing was crucial. A woman might bathe late at night, after the children were asleep and the chores done, hoping no one barged in mid-scrub. Then there was the modesty factor. Even in their own homes, Victorian women were taught to be modest to the point of near invisibility. Bathing was done quietly, often in layers. One popular method involved washing the body one limb at a time while keeping the rest clothed. And of course, bathroom doors didn't always lock or even exist, so a well-placed towel or the assistance of a trusted maid was vital. And let's talk about the bathrobes, or rather, the lack of them. A lady might wrap herself in a voluminous dressing gown after bathing, made of flannel or cotton, and worn until she was completely dry. These gowns were more like utility garments than luxurious wraps. Fashionable they were not. Practical? Absolutely. Especially when the nearest fire was 2 rooms away and the wind was howling through the cracks in the windows. Cleanliness, paradoxically, became both a virtue and a performance. Women were judged not by how often they bathed, but by how well they concealed the evidence of not doing so. Clean linens, fresh gloves, scented sachets, these were the signals of a well-kept woman. You didn't need to be clean, you just needed to appear clean. That illusion was everything. Historians still argue whether the once-a-week bath was truly standard or just aspirational. Diaries and housekeeping journals often describe Saturday bath night, particularly among working-class families. But there are just as many entries that reference a quick wash by the stove or sponging down before tea. What's certain is that full-body bathing was a rarity, a luxury carved out of time and hot water. Some women even embraced the dirt, at least passively. Medical opinions of the time varied wildly. One camp believed that too much bathing could weaken the system, or agitate the female nerves. Others swore by cold water therapy and icy plunges, claiming it toughened the spirit. Somewhere in between were the ordinary women just trying to get through the week without smelling like yesterday's stew. One quirky, lesser-known practice, dry bathing. Some women, particularly in the countryside, would rub their skin with dry cornmeal or bran to exfoliate and freshen the surface. It sounds odd, but by Victorian standards, it was a perfectly acceptable method. Add a little lavender oil and you had yourself a rustic spa day, minus the spa, the day, and the relaxation. Perhaps the most telling detail of all is how little was said. Bathing was a private affair, and Victorian women rarely mentioned it directly in letters or diaries. Instead, they referred to freshening up, or making ready for the evening. And when someone did mention a full bath, it was often couched in terms of luxury or indulgence. One lady wrote in 1867, "I took a long bath today and feel quite refreshed, though I fear I've caught a chill. So much effort, so many precautions, and all for the hope of a few brief minutes of cleanliness, quickly swallowed again by layers of fabric, coal smoke, and the long day ahead." Behind the lace-curtained parlours and tightly corseted decorum of Victorian life lay an even steamier, stranger space, the public bath. For those without the luxury of a private tub or the time and resources to warm bucket after bucket of water, public baths were both a godsend and a gamble. They promised cleanliness, but came with whispers, rumours, and, for Victorian women, a tangled knot of social anxiety. Picture it, a low-slung stone building in the corner of a sooty industrial town. Inside, the scent of coal smoke mingled with damp plaster, and an unmistakable bouquet of mildew and soap scum. Steam hung in the air like a soggy curtain, fogging up the glass windows and causing all manner of shadows to flicker across walls. This was not a luxurious Roman bath or a Turkish delight. This was utilitarian, efficient, and, if you were lucky, reasonably warm. Public baths had been around in England since Roman times, but it wasn't until the mid-19th century that modern bathhouses began cropping up in earnest. As urbanisation took hold and slums multiplied, reformers pushed for sanitation as a matter of public health. Cholera outbreaks, typhoid and general filth forced civic leaders to admit that perhaps a few baths wouldn't hurt. For women, however, stepping into a public bath was complicated. First, there was the issue of modesty. The idea of undressing anywhere outside one's bedroom, especially in a shared space, ran against every grain of Victorian propriety. Some bathhouses provided private stalls with wooden doors or heavy curtains, others did not. Many women simply refused to go, fearing not only exposure but judgment. Etiquette manuals didn't help. They advised women to bathe in utmost seclusion, and warned against letting servants or strangers see one's ankles, let alone more. So the idea of stripping down, even behind a curtain, in a municipal bathhouse frequented by neighbours and working men, unthinkable for many. Still, necessity has a way of overruling social terror. A working-class woman, particularly one without running water at home, might grit her teeth and make the trip once a week, or once a month, depending on what she could afford. Bathhouses charged a small fee, usually a penny or two, which paid for a shallow tub of tepid water, a sliver of harsh soap and a single coarse towel. The fee might also include a bar of lye soap so pungent it could strip paint. One woman recalled being scolded by a matronly attendant for trying to bring her own lavender-scented soap. "That's for the rich," the woman snapped. "You'll use what's provided." Clean or not, public baths were often viewed with suspicion. Rumours abounded that women were propositioned by men, that the attendants stole garments, that illness spread through reused water. None of these claims were entirely baseless. Privacy was imperfect, water was reused or poorly drained, and if you left your boots unattended, there was a good chance someone would walk out in them. Yet for all the discomfort, there was also relief. Relief in slipping into warm water, however shallow. Relief in loosening stays and soaking away the grime of the week. Relief in having even a small pocket of time to oneself, however communal it might be. Public bathhouses, interestingly, also became small social hubs. In working-class neighbourhoods, women coordinated their visits to chat, exchange gossip, and, without ever saying it aloud, compare hygiene techniques. These spaces provided a rare opportunity for unfiltered connection. Stripped of corsets and society's expectations, women sometimes spoke more freely. Complaints about husbands, rashes, the rising price of coal, or the mystery of male barbershop cologne, all aired out between latherings. Of course, that doesn't mean things were always so democratic. Class followed you everywhere in Victorian society, even into the bath. Some bathhouses offered first-class and second-class services. First class included private rooms, warm towels, better soap, and actual attendants who might help fill the tub or provide hair oil. Second class, a cracked stool, tepid water, and a towel that might have dried someone else 30 minutes ago. Not surprisingly, women who could afford first class clung to it tightly, even if they weren't wealthy elsewhere. For a few extra pennies, you could momentarily imagine yourself in a manor rather than a municipal bathhouse next to a brewery. Then there were the travelling bath carts, yes, mobile bath services. In some cities, enterprising bathmaids set up portable wooden tubs that could be wheeled from house to house, offering in-home baths to women who had neither time nor inclination to visit a public facility. These tubs were lined with canvas or tin and filled from large pails carried by the bathmaid, who charged extra for scented water, heated stones or additional towels. The most elite variation of this service included bathing in one's own parlour, with screens arranged for privacy, and a maid discreetly pouring water and handing over lemon-infused cloths. Imagine bathing beside your piano, a fire crackling in the grate, your pet terrier asleep by your side, Victorian multitasking at its finest. But for the vast majority, bathing remained a necessity, not a luxury. Public bathhouses reflected that. Their walls were lined with flaking paint, their floors were slick with soap residue, and their patrons, women wrapped in borrowed robes clutching their underclothes in bundles, were just trying to feel human again, if only for 20 minutes. In some towns, reformers established ladies-only bath days or hours to make the experience less fraught. Posters advertised these hours as for the fairer sex, no gentleman permitted. It worked, attendance rose. So did the price. Still, women showed up. They waited in long queues, stamped their feet in cold hallways and smiled tightly at neighbours they tried not to undress beside. And let's not forget the quirks. Some bathhouses provided hairdryers, by which we mean towels and hand fans. Others offered aromatic rinses, small basins of mint or vinegar water poured over the shoulders to provide a final refreshing touch. A few even piped in music, usually faint piano tunes or hymns, to maintain the illusion of serenity. Nothing quite like "Nearer my God to thee," while scrubbing your knees in reused bath water. Still, these bathhouses served a vital purpose. They kept people cleaner, reduced disease, and provided women, especially poor women, a place to tend to themselves. In an age where so much of their time and labour was poured into others, this mattered. A lot. Historians debate how empowering these spaces truly were. Some argue they gave women a sense of autonomy, a rare moment of self-care. Others see them as yet another chore in a life already filled with labour. But most agree, public baths were deeply formative, a strange intersection of vulnerability and resilience, and for many women, they were also deeply memorable. One lady recalled her mother saving up to take her to a first-class bath before a cousin's wedding. "We scrubbed, we soaked, we used rose soap from a real shop," she wrote. "It was the cleanest I've ever felt. Clean, yes, but also briefly free. free of housework, free of judgment, free of the daily grime, both physical and social. For a few minutes in a chipped porcelain tub behind a curtain that barely reached the floor, the Victorian woman could sigh, sink down and simply be. Of all the layers that made up a Victorian woman's wardrobe, petticoats, corsets, crinolines, chemises, perhaps none were quite so underappreciated or so misunderstood as the undergarments themselves. Yes, we're talking drawers, not the furniture kind, but the split-crotch kind. Welcome to the world of Victorian underwear, a universe of linen, lace and logistics that made bathroom trips both possible and absurdly complex. Let's start with a fact that still surprises many. Most Victorian women didn't wear what we'd now recognise as panties. Instead, they wore drawers, loose-fitting, knee-length underpants that were open at the crotch. Not split, not slit. Entirely open. The logic? Convenience. Remember those towering layers of skirts, petticoats, bustles, and maybe even a hoop frame? Getting fully undressed to use a chamber pot was impractical at best and impossible at worst. The open crotch design allowed a woman to relieve herself without having to wrestle with buttons, ties, or stays. And yes, they worked. Sort of. If everything lined up correctly, it was a marvel of low-tech engineering. But if not, let's just say misalignments were common, especially for women in motion or during their monthly cycle. Victorian ladies learned early on to manoeuvre with precision and to sit carefully. Crossed legs could lead to breezy surprises. Above the drawers came the chemise, a light sleeveless linen or cotton underdress, worn to protect outer garments from sweat and body oils. Most women owned several, rotating them through their week and laundering them as often as they could manage. In wealthier homes, a maid might collect the soiled chemise daily. In poorer homes, it might be worn for several days at a time, especially in winter when washing was both difficult and freezing. Drawers themselves were made from cotton, linen or flannel, depending on the season. They could be plain or elaborately trimmed with lace and ribbons, especially for those who valued aesthetic touches even in the most hidden parts of their wardrobe. Young girls and unmarried women often wore simpler versions, while married women, or those trying to make a statement, might favour more decorative styles. But the open design didn't stop at practicality. Victorian morality shaped undergarments with an almost theological fervour. Everything hidden had to be modest, even if it served a very unmodest function. One etiquette manual insisted that a lady's drawers must be both functional and virtuous, never suggestive. Translation: no silk unless you are married, and even then proceed with caution. Interestingly, some women chose not to wear drawers at all. Particularly in the early Victorian period, going bare beneath the chemise was still somewhat common among the lower classes. The reasoning? Fewer layers meant more freedom of movement and fewer garments to wash. But as the century progressed, drawers became the expected norm, and going without began to be viewed as uncouth, even indecent. Historians still argue over how universally drawers were worn. Personal diaries from the 1840s and 50s show a range of habits, with some women referring to them dismissively as modern nonsense, and others praising them for easing daily transitions. It wasn't until the latter half of the century that drawers became as essential as the corset. And about that corset, yes, it was worn over the chemise and over the drawers, often cinching the entire lower torso into a breathless hourglass. The corset defined the silhouette, but it also defined posture, movement, and unfortunately digestive function. When paired with split drawers, a woman could, in theory, visit the lavatory without removing her corset. In practice, however, many had to loosen the laces or unhook the front busk just to find relief. Above all this came the petticoats, crinolines and bustles. These added weight, volume, and a surprising degree of warmth, which is probably why so few women froze to death despite walking around in dresses during snowstorms. The downside: using the toilet required hiking up several pounds of skirt and petticoat, usually with both hands and hoping everything stayed balanced while manoeuvring over a pot, privy, or precarious public facility. It was, quite literally, a juggling act. And yet, for all their complexity, Victorian undergarments held a certain elegance. A well-stitched chemise with lace edging, or drawers embroidered with tiny initials carried a quiet pride. Some women kept sewing boxes just for underthings, complete with pearl buttons, delicate ribbons, and fragrant sachets. Others made their own, learning to cut and hem linen with the same care they might apply to darning socks or decorating a handkerchief. There was also a growing market for ready-made undergarments, especially in cities. drapers and specialty shops sold drawers, chemises, and corset covers alongside gloves and handkerchiefs. These items were often displayed discreetly, never in windows, and always sold with the utmost decorum. "No eye should linger where propriety holds reign," declared one London shopkeeper in an 1878 letter. By the end of the 19th century, underwear had become a booming business. Fashion magazines like the English Woman's Domestic magazine printed elaborate patterns for making your own drawers, complete with measurements and instructions. "A lady may thus ensure the purity of her person," one issue explained, "by knowing precisely what touches her most intimately." Of course, not all garments were purely practical. The rise of the boudoir set marked a shift in how underclothes were seen. While still modest by modern standards, these coordinated sets, matching drawers, chemise and corset cover, suggested that lingerie could be both functional and beautiful. A gift of lace-trimmed drawers became a sign of wifely attention or bridal virtue, something to be admired in the private realm even if no one else ever saw it. Still, Victorian prudery cast a long shadow. Women were expected to manage their underthings in absolute secrecy. No drying drawers by the fire, no talking about split crotches in mixed company. If a maid saw her mistress's undergarments, she was expected to pretend she hadn't. The same went for laundresses, tailors, and shop assistants. Silence and discretion were the true foundation garments of Victorian modesty. One rather delightful exception, the rational dress movement. These reformers, often women involved in early suffrage campaigns, advocated for more practical clothing, including knickerbockers, closed-crotch pants that looked suspiciously like modern bloomers. They were often worn under long tunics and promoted as healthier, freer, and less absurd than traditional skirts and petticoats. Naturally, society reacted with horror. Newspapers derided the movement. Churchmen warned that a woman in trousers is a threat to decency. But the bloomers persisted, and while most Victorian women never abandoned their split drawers entirely, some began to experiment, at least in private, with the idea of a wardrobe that wasn't a daily obstacle course. In rural areas, women made do with whatever materials they had. Old sheets became chemises, flour sacks became drawers. Elastic was rare and precious, so most undergarments were tied at the waist with cotton tape or fastened with buttons. One farmer's wife recalled that her first pair of drawers were made by her grandmother, who embroidered a tiny daisy into the waistband so I'd know they were mine. Quaint, yes, but also deeply revealing, because even in a world where talking about underwear was taboo, women found ways to claim ownership over it. Through stitching, through scent, through daily ritual, they made those hidden layers their own. And that's what makes Victorian undergarments so fascinating. They were at once secretive and essential, unspoken and unforgettable. Split crotches, tied waists and all, they tell a story of adaptation, endurance, and the silent mastery of complexity. Because if you could navigate a public bath in a chemise and split drawers while holding up 4 layers of skirts, and pretending nothing was happening, you, dear listener, were a professional. Somewhere between the jasmine sachets and the stiff corsetry, there exists a curious moment in the Victorian bathroom, a sudden whisper of Europe, as it were. It arrived shaped like a small porcelain basin with delicate legs, often perched daintily beside the chamber pot. The bidet had entered the chat. Imported from France and whispered about in English drawing rooms, the bidet was both a mystery and a scandal. While it had been common in French households since the 17th century to the Victorian Englishwoman, it was something of a foreign oddity, one that tiptoed dangerously close to indecency. After all, anything involving water and a woman's undercarriage was bound to stir suspicion. Let's be clear, the Victorian bidet was not the sleek nozzle sprayer we know today. It was more of a low bowl or basin, designed for a woman to straddle while she poured water from a ewer and used her hands or a cloth to cleanse herself. It was, in essence, a very targeted wash, and it promised something tantalising, personal hygiene between baths. But therein lay the problem. The bidet's intimacy was both its strength and its undoing in buttoned-up British society. Cleanliness was virtuous, yes, but too much attention to one's lower anatomy raised eyebrows. A lady might be suspected of vanity, or worse, of moral laxity, and yet they spread. Quietly, elegantly, discreetly. A bidet in an English household was never called a bidet. It was referred to euphemistically as a lady's basin or a hygienic fixture. Some even hid them inside wooden cabinets that doubled as washstands. revealing their true function only to those who needed to know. Victorian women who embraced the bidet were often frequent travellers, those who had spent time on the continent and returned with a taste for its more direct approach to hygiene. Wealthy women, accustomed to private bathrooms and the ministrations of maids, found it a convenient way to freshen up without the ordeal of a full bath. They weren't wrong. In a time when many bathed only weekly, the bidet offered a quiet revolution in cleanliness. The experience was delicate and surprisingly ritualistic. Water was warmed, never too hot, never too cold, often with a touch of rose water or vinegar for freshness. A cloth was used, then carefully laundered and dried. Some bidets even came with a small built-in drawer for storing scented soaps and linen towels. It was a solitary, silent moment, perhaps the only one in a day where a Victorian woman could tend to herself without interruption. Yet, despite its utility, the bidet was regarded with suspicion by many. Etiquette manuals refused to mention it outright. Medical journals danced around the topic with cryptic phrases like feminine ablutions and continental practices not advised for general adoption. Even the most forward-thinking writers hesitated, afraid to suggest that women might enjoy caring for their own bodies with such precision. One widely circulated health pamphlet went so far as to warn that frequent dousing of the parts may induce nervous excitation, the underlying fear that a woman might discover sensations she was not supposed to acknowledge, let alone pursue. It's a revealing peek into how hygiene and morality were intertwined in the Victorian mind. Cleanliness was good, but only if it was modest, silent, and preferably supervised. Of course, French women had no such qualms. In Paris, the bidet was as common as the fireplace, and women of every social class used it without blushing. English travellers were often shocked to find bidets in hotel rooms, especially in more upscale establishments. There are records of British women covering them with towels, assuming they were footbaths, plant stands, or, most incorrectly, bird baths. One particularly stern English woman reportedly threw a towel over hers every morning and used it as a pedestal for her Bible. The maid, understandably confused, kept removing it and refilling the basin with warm water, and yet the bidet persevered. Quietly, patiently. It took up residence in dressing rooms and behind screens, waiting out the judgment. Some English manufacturers began to offer their own sanitary basins, marketed not as bidets but as personal rinse fixtures. These came with painted porcelain, brass fittings and the occasional warming pipe. Their purpose was never openly stated, but women knew. Meanwhile, medical professionals began to change their tune. By the late 19th century, doctors who specialised in women's health began cautiously recommending bidets for postpartum care, during menstruation, and for general tonic refreshment. It was a breakthrough, an admission, however coded, that women might benefit from regular cleansing. Historians still argue how widespread the use of bidets truly became in Victorian England. Some claim they remained a niche luxury, limited to cosmopolitan households and progressive minds. Others suggest they were quietly embraced, tucked away behind screens and beneath euphemisms, but present nonetheless. The truth, as always, lies in between. We know from estate inventories that bidets were indeed part of many upper-class households by the 1880s. We know from catalogues that at least a few English firms made and sold them, and we know from whispered letters and journal entries. I have found the little basin terribly convenient, especially these past few days, that women used them, even if they never spoke their name. There's even one wonderfully bizarre anecdote about a duchess who travelled with her personal bidet strapped to the roof of her carriage. It was painted to look like a trunk and covered in velvet. A maid would unpack it and warm the water before bedtime, setting it up behind a 3-panel screen. The Duchess insisted it helped her sleep. In the end, the bidet was many things. A scandal, a saviour, a French flirtation. It bridged the gap between cleanliness and control, offering women a rare chance to tend to their bodies on their own terms. And while it never became as common as the chamber pot or the wash basin, it whispered its presence throughout Victorian bathrooms like a well-kept secret. Today, it's easy to overlook that dainty basin in a museum or antique shop. But for the Victorian woman who owned one, it represented something quietly radical. The power to care for oneself, to be clean without asking permission, and to engage with her own body in a way that was personal, purposeful, and deeply private. It was, in its own small way, liberation by porcelain. Victorian women were often portrayed as delicate creatures, liable to swoon at the slightest excitement. If you've ever wondered why fainting couches were standard furnishings, and why every decent lady carried a vial of smelling salts, the answer lies in one mysterious and much misunderstood phrase: the vapours. Ah yes, the catch-all affliction for the exhausted, the overstimulated, the emotionally flustered, or simply the female. The vapours was a term used throughout the 18th and 19th centuries to describe a wide range of symptoms: fainting, nervousness, breathlessness, anxiety, palpitations, and general malaise. It was believed to stem from disturbances in the body's humours, or the influence of foul airs rising from the stomach and affecting the brain. In modern terms, it was a mix of what we'd now label anxiety attacks, hormonal shifts, blood sugar crashes, or even just plain fatigue. But in the Victorian mind, it was very much a woman's condition, and of course there was one major culprit: the corset. Tightly laced, stiffened with whalebone or steel, the corset constricted the torso and forced organs upward. This left the lungs with less space to expand and the diaphragm unable to do its full job. The result? Shallow breathing, lightheadedness, and yes, fainting. Combine that with the heat of a crowded ballroom, the pressure of social performance, and the general suppression of strong emotion, and you have a recipe for theatrical collapses on divans. Enter the fainting couch. Not just decorative furniture, these were strategically placed in bedrooms, parlours, and ladies' lounges for just such emergencies. Long, low, with one armrest and a gently sloping back, the fainting couch allowed a woman to recline with grace when her sensibilities were overwhelmed. They became so common that many women owned one before they had a proper washroom. But not all fainting spells were dramatic or even noticed. Many women simply sat down quietly, loosened a few hooks on their corset, and waited for the room to stop spinning. A well-timed handkerchief and a dose of smelling salts, a pungent mix of ammonia and lavender, often brought things back into balance. And sometimes the vapours were less about actual symptoms and more about what society allowed women to express. In a culture that discouraged female anger, passion, or even assertiveness, a fainting spell could be a socially acceptable way to disengage. A woman couldn't shout or storm out, but she could swoon. There's something both tragic and clever about that. In the absence of permission to speak plainly, the body became the voice. A fluttering heart, a flushed cheek, a dramatic collapse. They were signals, protests, releases. The vapours weren't always weakness. Sometimes they were resistance. Of course, not every case of the vapours was a quiet protest. There were also medical diagnoses to contend with, namely female hysteria. This term, tossed around liberally by Victorian doctors, became a fashionable umbrella under which nearly any woman's ailment could be filed. Anxiety, irritability, insomnia, nervousness, sexual frustration, sadness. It all became hysteria, an illness of the womb and nerves. One influential doctor claimed that a woman's uterus could wander throughout the body, pressing against the heart or brain and causing symptoms. No, really. This floating womb theory led to a wave of dubious treatments, many of which had little basis in science but a great deal of staying power. Treatments for hysteria ranged from warm baths and bed rest to electric therapy and herbal tonics. Some were harmless, others were downright invasive. One common cure was the application of leeches near the pelvic area to draw away heat. Another involved the use of hand-cranked massage devices by physicians, a practice that, for obvious reasons, later led to the invention of mechanical vibrators and some very awkward patents. Historians still debate whether these treatments were exploitative or, ironically, one of the only available forms of sexual release in a society that repressed women's bodily autonomy. The answer, predictably, is complicated. Some women embraced the hysteria diagnosis because it granted them a break, a chance to rest, to be excused from social duties, or to avoid childbirth for a time. One upper-class lady reportedly spent an entire season recuperating at a seaside resort, with daily massages, light reading, and afternoon lemon water, all courtesy of a vague diagnosis of nervous fatigue. Others, however, found the label stifling. Once diagnosed with hysteria, a woman's credibility could be permanently compromised. Her opinions, her requests, her pain, all dismissed as symptoms. Diaries from the period show women pleading not to be labelled hysterical, insisting they were simply tired, overwhelmed, or grieving. And who could blame them? life as a Victorian woman was exhausting. Between the physical restrictions of fashion, the constant demand for propriety, the pressure to manage a household or perform in one, and the emotional labour of keeping everyone else comfortable, many women were simply worn down. Their bodies carried what their mouths were forbidden to say. Even young girls weren't immune. Teenagers who showed signs of defiance, melancholy, or excessive enthusiasm were sometimes labelled as delicate or emotionally unstable. They were prescribed quiet time, denied stimulating books, or placed under the watchful eye of a governess trained in the art of genteel suppression. One fringe yet telling trend was the rest cure, developed in the late 19th century. This involved isolating a woman in bed for weeks or months, denying her any form of mental stimulation, including reading or conversation, and feeding her milk and meat broth while her muscles atrophied. The idea was to restore the nerves. In reality, it often led to depression, resentment, and, in more than one case, outright rebellion. Famed author Charlotte Perkins Gilman critiqued this practice in her short story The Yellow Wallpaper, based on her own experience with the rest cure. In it, a woman slowly unravels under forced confinement, projecting her descent into madness onto the swirling patterns of her bedroom wallpaper. It's a haunting metaphor for what happened when women were denied expression and agency. Still, not all Victorian women accepted the vapours, hysteria, or fainting as inevitable. Some took their health into their own hands. They joined health clubs, practiced calisthenics, rode bicycles, and even advocated for looser corsets or none at all. These early rebels were mocked, bloomers, hysterics, mannish girls, but they planted the seeds of change. Others turned to alternative medicine. Homeopathy, herbalism, and hydrotherapy flourished among women who felt dismissed by male physicians. Women exchanged recipes for chamomile compresses, valerian root tea, or dandelion tinctures. They followed the moon's phases, charted their symptoms, and began to understand their bodies as more than vessels of propriety. One particularly resilient group? The bathers. Women who swore by cold water therapy would plunge into rivers, lakes, or icy tubs each morning, believing it cleared the mind and strengthened the spirit. Was it science? Not entirely, but it gave them a sense of control, and sometimes that was enough. In the end, the Victorian era was filled with contradictions. Women were told to be delicate but strong, modest but alluring, silent but expressive, and when they failed to fit those impossible moulds, they were diagnosed with the vapours. But beneath the swoons and salts, the couches and cures, lay a quiet truth. Victorian women were not fragile. They were strategic. They adapted. They navigated absurd expectations with a level of grace and wit that often went unnoticed by the men writing their prescriptions. And while they might have occasionally collapsed onto a fainting couch, you can bet they got right back up again. Corset hooks, ammonia vial and all. If the Victorian bathroom was a theatre of discretion and ritual, then the toilet table was its main stage, an altar to self-maintenance where beauty, hygiene, and a touch of medical speculation all blended into one delicate morning ceremony. Here, under soft gaslight or near a draughty window, a woman faced her reflection and prepared herself for the day with tooth powder, hair pomade, rose water, and whatever mysterious tonic her aunt had insisted upon the previous season. The toilet table, or dressing table, wasn't just a place for powdering one's nose. It was a central piece of a Victorian woman's daily life, an essential part of her toilette, a word which at the time referred not to the loo, but to the entire act of washing, grooming and dressing. These tables were often ornate. Carved wood, marble tops, mirrors with scalloped edges, and drawers filled with tools of the trade. On their surface lay a collection of pots, brushes, bottles and vials, each with its own purpose and occasionally an ominous label. Tooth care, for instance, was both an expected part of grooming and a source of intense speculation. Tooth powder, not toothpaste, was the standard. Sold in tins or paper packets, these powders often included baking soda, chalk, crushed charcoal, or even powdered cuttlefish bone. The goal was to scrub away stains and freshen breath. Though many of these mixtures were abrasive enough to wear down enamel over time, flavours range from mint and cloves to the slightly more terrifying camphor and myrrh, or tincture of soot. Women used small brushes with natural bristles, often boar hair, or tiny cloths to polish each tooth. The process was not quick, and certainly not pleasant, but social pressure to maintain clean, white teeth was strong. After all, a lady with bad breath was suspect. A lady with missing teeth? Practically tragic. Some even carried portable tooth cleaning kits, small velvet-lined cases containing a brush, tooth powder and a silver pick. These might be tucked discreetly into a travel bag or drawer, ready for mid-visit freshening, and while floss was not common, toothpicks, often made of ivory or wood, were. Beyond the teeth, attention turned to the skin. Cold cream was a staple, used for both cleansing and moisturising. Made from a mixture of wax, oils and rosewater, it had a cooling, soothing effect. Women applied it with soft cloths or their fingers, rubbing in small circles, then wiping away the residue with another clean rag. This routine served not just cosmetic purposes, but also helped remove the layers of soot and coal dust that settled on every exposed surface in industrial England. More ambitious women used toners and tinctures, often alcohol-based liquids meant to tighten the pores and brighten the complexion. These were poured from glass bottles with glass stoppers, releasing sharp scents of witch hazel, vinegar or lavender. Many claimed to banish freckles, though those freckles were more often the result of sun exposure than any imagined impurity. And let us not forget the beauty patches, small bits of silk or velvet cut into stars or hearts and pasted onto the face to cover blemishes or add a flirtatious flair. A carryover from 18th century fashion, these patches were still worn by some stylish women during the Victorian era, often under the guise of medical necessity. A touch of mutton fat and beeswax will adhere it nicely, advised one beauty column, just near the temple, to draw attention upward. Next came the hair, which we'll explore more thoroughly later, but it's worth noting here. The toilet table often included not just combs and brushes, but bottles of hair oil, tonics promising renewed growth, and even home-use curling irons, long metal rods heated over a lamp or fire, and then carefully wielded to create ringlets. One wrong move, and your fringe was singed. But fashion demanded perseverance. Then there was makeup, or rather, the pretense that no makeup was being used at all. Victorian women were expected to appear naturally lovely, which in practice meant applying tiny amounts of rouge, powder or lip tint and denying it completely. A light touch of carmine on the cheeks, merely a flush from brisk air, a dab of beeswax tinted red on the lips, the afterglow of tea. Commercially, there were plenty of options. Pomades and rouges were sold in chemist shops, often under the guise of complexion aids or skin restorers. The packaging was discreet, the marketing was insistent. Not paint, but polish, one ad assured, suitable for refined ladies. Still, makeup was a risky business. Too much, and you were accused of artifice. Or worse, compared to actresses or courtesans. One etiquette guide warned, "A lady may brush her cheeks with rosewater, but she must never resemble a doll. Nature, modesty and propriety are her cosmetics." What this modesty rule meant was that everything had to look effortless, even if it took an hour to achieve. Hence the toilet table's true role, not as a site of indulgence, but as a workshop for constructing the illusion of natural perfection. And beyond the beauty regimen, the toilet table also had its medical side. Many women kept a collection of household remedies within reach. Bottles of tincture of opium, yes, laudanum, peppermint oil for indigestion, lavender water for nerves, and various bitters and tonics for female troubles. These tonics often promised to fortify the blood, invigorate the womb, or restore harmony to the female system. Many were laced with alcohol or morphine. Some, tragically, were toxic. Historians still argue whether Victorian women truly believed in the efficacy of these tonics or whether they were simply the only option available. Either way, they were part of the daily ritual. A spoonful in the morning, a second dose before bed. Alongside the powdering and brushing, a little chemical courage to face another day. Smelling salts were also part of the kit. In a delicate silver vial or etched glass bottle, these were ammonia-based stimulants used to revive fainting women, or just give a midday boost. A lady might hold the salts beneath her nose and inhale gently, not too deeply, or pass them to a friend in distress. They were especially popular among those who wore their corsets tight, or attended long airless events like church services or society balls. Also found on the toilet table, tweezers for wayward hairs, eyebrow combs, yes, that's a thing, and nail buffers, no polish, just shine. Gloves were expected to cover hands during the day, but those hands had to be soft and manicured beneath. Lemon juice was a common bleaching agent for nails. Olive oil or almond oil was rubbed into cuticles. A well-tended hand was a sign of refinement, and finally there were the scents. Not the overpowering perfumes of the ballroom, but the subtler daily fragrances applied after grooming. Rosewater, violet tincture, orange blossom cologne, dabbed onto the wrists, behind the ears, or into handkerchiefs. These were the scents that marked a woman's private sphere. The invisible signature she left behind on her gloves, her letters, her pillowcase. Some women even kept lockets filled with scented pomade, opening them discreetly for a calming sniff during stressful moments. Others tied tiny sachets around their corset stays, filling them with dried herbs and petals to keep the body's scent floral, even in the absence of a recent bath. The toilet table, then, was more than a piece of furniture. It was a command centre, a site of self-definition, however constrained by societal rules. Here, in the quiet hours before the household stirred or after the last candle was blown out, Victorian women confronted themselves, literally and metaphorically. They dabbed, brushed, rinsed, powdered, medicated and perfumed. They stitched together a version of themselves that the world could accept, one brush stroke at a time, and whether they loved or loathed the ritual, they understood its power. Because in a society where appearances ruled and modesty masked reality, the toilet table gave them a rare sense of control, a space where, behind the mirror's reflection and the rustle of lace, they could pause, breathe, and ready themselves for whatever came next. If you've ever groaned at the thought of washing your hair after just 2 days, spare a thought for the Victorian woman who might go weeks, yes, weeks, between hair washes. But don't assume she went about with greasy locks flapping in the coal-tinged breeze. No, managing hair was a strategic operation involving dry brushing, pomades, oils, and a near-religious adherence to ritual. It was, in many ways, the crown jewel of the Victorian woman's toilette. Hair wasn't just style, it was identity, virtue, and often social currency. A thick, well-groomed mane symbolised health, fertility, and moral character. Women grew it long, very long, often to their waists or even beyond. Cutting one's hair short, outside of illness or scandal, was nearly unthinkable. Even widows, those paragons of solemnity, often kept their long hair tied back beneath their mourning veils. But maintaining these glossy rivers of hair without frequent washing required finesse. Victorian women brushed constantly. Morning and night, 100 strokes was the golden number, drawn from a mix of superstition, hygiene, and sheer habit. Brushing not only untangled the hair, but distributed natural oils from the scalp along the shaft, giving the illusion of shine and freshness. Brushes were made with natural bristles, boar hair being the most desirable, and were cleaned meticulously with combs and even soap on occasion. As for washing, it was a major event. Not the stand under a shower and rinse sort, but a basin-based, back-breaking affair that involved multiple bowls of water, a maid, if you had one, and a half-day of effort. The head would be leaned back or forward over a basin, and water poured from a jug. Soap, not shampoo mind you, but actual soap, was rubbed into the scalp. Sometimes it was Castile soap, sometimes a homemade blend, sometimes a harsh, alkaline bar that left the scalp tingling and the hair like straw. To combat this dryness, women turned to hair oils and pomades. Macassar oil was the most famous, advertised in every women's magazine and stocked on countless toilet tables. A thick, glossy formula made from coconut or palm oil, Macassar gave hair that sleek, lacquered look considered the pinnacle of Victorian chic. So ubiquitous was its use that antimacassars, those little lace doilies placed on the backs of chairs, were invented solely to protect upholstery from oily smudges. Besides Macassar, there were dozens of other concoctions: bear grease, yes, actual bear fat, castor oil, rose-infused pomade, or mixtures brewed at home with ingredients like egg yolk, brandy, vinegar, and even onion juice. Some promised lustre, others regrowth. A few came dangerously close to medical fraud, claiming to cure baldness or stimulate ladylike follicles. Most did little more than coat the hair in sheen and fragrance. But in a world without dry shampoo, it was better than nothing. And here's where things get especially interesting. Victorian women didn't just style their own hair. They often wore extra hair, sometimes theirs, sometimes someone else's. Hairpieces, extensions, braids, and even full pastiches, like early wigs, were commonly used to bulk up elaborate styles. These add-ons were stored in special boxes, brushed, perfumed, and occasionally mistaken for dust bunnies when left on the floor. The hair market, particularly for human hair, boomed in the 19th century. Entire industries sprang up around collecting and selling hair, often from rural women in France, Italy, or Germany. Hair merchants would travel through towns buying cut hair, which was then cleaned, sorted and sold to fashion houses or directly to clients. Blondes fetched the highest prices, auburn the most romanticised, black the most common. Victorian women were often both horrified and fascinated by the idea of wearing another woman's hair. One does not ask from whence it came, wrote one columnist, so long as it flatters the brow. Still, letters reveal a mix of curiosity and disgust. Some women insisted on growing their own additions, saving their own hair from brushes and combs, storing it in little pots called hair receivers, and later having it fashioned into curls or braids. And what about hairstyles themselves? Styles changed over the decades, but most had this in common: height, volume, and symbolism. A centre part with smooth sides and a chignon at the nape was classic. In the 1860s, women piled curls over the forehead, while later years favoured coiled buns and braided coronets. Every style required dozens of pins, and if one went rogue in public, social tragedy. Hair also told stories. A loose strand slipping from a bun could signal illness, grief, or even sexual awakening. Girls wore their hair down until about 16, when they ceremonially pinned it up to mark womanhood. Widows covered their hair completely or wore it plainly. Married women might wear a lock of their husband's hair in a locket, while lovers exchanged braided strands as tokens. Mourning jewellery, an entire category of Victorian accessorising, often included hair from the deceased, coiled into brooches or woven into bracelets. Historians still debate whether the average woman enjoyed or endured her hair rituals. Some, especially among the upper classes, had maids to help with washing, drying and arranging. Others did it all themselves, standing for hours at a mirror with arms aching from lifting long, heavy hair. Diaries show both pride and fatigue. Entries like, "Arrange my hair again, a tiresome chore," followed a few weeks later by "Emma admired the shine of my braid. I was quite pleased." Drying hair was a major hurdle. Without blow dryers, hair was left to air dry, often taking several hours. In winter, this meant sitting near the hearth with a towel around the shoulders, sipping weak tea and hoping the dampness didn't cause a chill. Some women plaited their hair while wet to produce waves, wrapping the braids around their heads for a halo effect. Others used rags, rolling hair into curls and sleeping on them overnight for ringlets come morning. Hair was also tied to morality. A woman who let her hair down in public, literally, was seen as disreputable. Actresses, dancers, or women of ill repute often wore their hair loose on stage, a symbol of wildness and sensuality. Even in private, letting one's hair fall in front of another person, especially a man, was an act heavy with implication. And yet, there was also comfort in the ritual. The brushing, the oiling, the careful braiding, it gave structure to the day. For many women, it was one of the few moments where they could simply be still, focused on themselves and not the world's demands. Mothers braided daughters' hair while humming lullabies. Sisters helped each other arrange curls before a dance. Widows, alone in their rooms, brushed hair no one else would see. The toilet table mirrored these quiet gestures. There, among combs and pomades, a woman found time to tend to herself, not for show but for order. And in a world where she was expected to maintain appearances at all costs, the illusion of control, however oily, however tangled, was precious. So the next time you grumble about dry shampoo or roll your eyes at a bad hair day, remember this. A Victorian woman might have gone a month without washing her hair, worn 3 pounds of someone else's braid on her head, singed her fringe with a fireplace-heated rod, and still faced the world with pinned-up composure. Now that's dedication. In a world so finely constructed around rules, expectations and appearances, Victorian women lived under an invisible but heavy canopy of modesty, particularly when it came to personal hygiene. Moral cleanliness wasn't just a phrase, it was a code, a full-bodied demand that dictated everything from how a woman washed her face to how she hung her underclothes to dry. This wasn't merely about being clean, it was about being seen to be clean, in body and in soul. Victorian modesty was all-encompassing. It went beyond clothing and behaviour and seeped into the domestic sphere with relentless tenacity. A woman's bathroom routine, though absolutely necessary, was meant to remain hidden, even from the other women in the household. There was a firm line between the ladylike and the indelicate, and crossing it, accidentally or otherwise, could invite judgment, gossip, or worse. Take, for instance, the very idea of talking about bodily needs. Euphemisms reigned supreme. A woman did not relieve herself. She retired to refresh. She didn't mention that she was menstruating. She was merely indisposed. Needing to change underclothes wasn't discussed. It was managed quietly, with garments folded and concealed in layers of wrapping before being carried to the laundry. In private, women had rituals for washing that were almost sacred in their structure. A morning toilette involved removing a nightgown with deliberate care, washing one's face, neck and underarms with cold water, preferably scented, and donning a fresh chemise, all while never standing entirely naked. Full nudity, even alone, was considered undignified. Some women washed one section of the body at a time, pulling clothing up or aside, then redressing before proceeding to the next area. The idea was never to see too much of oneself, not in the mirror, and certainly not by accident. Underclothing was washed separately and dried discreetly. One common practice was to hang under things behind larger linens, or in secluded garden corners where they could dry without being seen by visiting eyes, or male household staff. Even mentioning that a corset had become soiled was taboo. It simply required attention, and the maid who managed it knew better than to speak of it. But what if a woman didn't follow these rules? What if she broke from the quiet modesty of her upbringing and, say, asked aloud where the lavatory was at a dinner party? Cue the gasps. Victorian etiquette books were filled with warnings, written in calm yet terrifyingly absolute prose, about what could happen to a woman's reputation if she failed to maintain bodily discretion. One popular manual stated, "A young lady's virtue is seen not in her declarations but in her deportment, her presentation, and her silences." In other words, say nothing. Always. Even within the home, children were taught to knock before entering a bedroom, not just out of respect, but out of fear that they might catch sight of something unspeakable. A woman might be brushing her hair in her dressing gown, or worse, tending to her foot calluses, a horrifying breach of innocence. Historians still argue whether this strict modesty was more about morality or control. On the surface, it was about propriety, keeping a woman's body, and anything related to it, firmly in the realm of the sacred and unspoken. But beneath that, there was a clear message. Your body is not entirely your own. It belongs to society, to decorum, to the image you present. Manage it quietly, efficiently, and with absolute discretion, or suffer social exile. For those who deviated, even slightly, the consequences could be brutal. A woman caught bathing with her door ajar might earn a reputation for being fast. A laundress who saw her mistress's unmentionables and whispered their poor condition could tarnish a family's name. In one infamous scandal, a London debutante was supposedly blackballed from society because she discussed crinoline rust during tea, a topic far too close to bodily maintenance for polite company. And yet, in private, the same women who mastered the art of modest performance developed deeply personal rituals that bordered on spiritual. Lavender sachets, rose petal rinses, linen towels embroidered by hand. These were acts of care in a world that demanded invisibility. They stitched modesty into every detail, not out of shame necessarily, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Even furniture played its part. Washstands had drawers for hiding soiled linens. Toiletry bottles were labelled in Latin or in vague phrases like restorative essence. Potpourri bowls masked odours not just with scent, but with virtue. The bathroom, if there was one, might be hidden behind a screen or integrated into a dressing room to avoid the vulgarity of acknowledging its purpose. There was also a curious blend of science and superstition shaping these modesty codes. Women were warned that exposure to drafts while bathing could weaken the womb, or that direct sunlight on bare skin might cause immodest thoughts. Medical advice often reinforced the idea that a good woman should not think too much about her body, let alone experiment with its rhythms or comforts. Hence the rise of moral hygiene, a movement that blended religious guidance with health advice. Young girls were given pamphlets on purity and polish, which urged daily washing, but only of certain parts, and only with guidance from a mother or governess. These manuals rarely gave practical information. Instead, They were filled with allegories and cautionary tales. Cleanliness is next to godliness, they insisted, but always stopped short of telling you what to do when your underarms actually smelled. This silence extended into education. Few girls received formal instruction on anatomy, and almost none were taught about sexual health or reproduction beyond vague warnings. The result? A generation of women navigating monthly cycles, pregnancy and menopause, with only whispers from older relatives or servants to guide them. And let's not forget the role of religion. For many, bodily modesty was tied directly to spiritual purity. Nuns, for example, adhered to rigorous bathing schedules that prioritised discretion over cleanliness. One convent rulebook instructed sisters to wash only in their undergarments and to guard the eyes against the sight of flesh. Protestant households shared similar values. A woman might never speak of her bathroom needs aloud, even to her husband. To do so was to risk spiritual as well as social fallout. Still, there were exceptions. Women who rebelled quietly against this rigid modesty. Artists, writers, and social reformers began to question the taboo. They wrote essays and letters challenging the idea that the body was shameful. Some formed women's health clubs, where hygiene and anatomy were discussed openly, albeit behind closed doors. A few even published pamphlets, scandalous for the time, advocating for proper bathing and understanding of reproductive health. One such pioneer, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor in the UK, spoke bluntly about the dangers of ignorance. "A woman who knows her body is not unclean," she wrote. "She is prepared. She is empowered." That one sentence may have horrified half of Victorian society, but for the other half it was quietly revolutionary. And that's the contradiction at the heart of Victorian modesty. Behind all the whispers and euphemisms, there was a deep hunger for knowledge, for ownership, for truth. Women may have hidden their wash basins and stitched lavender into their drawers, but they also wrote in journals, taught each other in secret, and slowly, carefully, pushed back against the idea that modesty meant silence. Because deep down they knew something modern readers often forget. The most powerful modesty isn't about shame, it's about choice. And when choice is taken away, modesty becomes a mask. The Victorian bathroom in all its frills and fig leaves was not just a place of cleanliness. It was a stage, a confessional, a battlefield. And in the act of washing without being seen, of grooming in whispered code, of folding under things in layers of linen and secrecy, women didn't just maintain modesty, they carried the full weight of it, silently, every single day. If the Victorian woman was expected to glide through her day with quiet elegance, then behind that gliding figure was usually someone crouched over a chamber pot, scrubbing lye into linens and trying not to gag. The servant. For all the whispered modesty and porcelain decorum of upper and middle class women, it was often their maids who bore the true brunt of the Victorian bathroom burden. These were the invisible hands that upheld the illusion. Let's begin with the morning ritual. A lady of means would rise to find her wash basin filled, her fresh water heated, her towels warmed by the fire. Who arranged all this? The chambermaid, typically up at dawn, or earlier, hauling buckets from the scullery, building a fire in the bedroom grate, and setting out the day's toilet tools: combs, cloths, tooth powder, hair oil. And she did it all quietly. A good maid was practically a phantom, leaving no trace of her labour except warm water and neatly folded linen. And yet these maids were intimate witnesses to their mistress's most private routines. They saw hair unbraided, underclothes soiled, chamber pots full. Victorian etiquette demanded that none of this ever be acknowledged. The good servant, one manual advised, is deaf, blind, and mute to all that occurs in her lady's chamber. It was a performance of discretion that bordered on espionage. Chamber pots, for instance, had to be emptied daily, often more than once. This was not a graceful process. The contents were poured into larger vessels, slop pails or outside receptacles. Then the pots were scrubbed with hot water and carbolic acid or vinegar. Maids had to navigate narrow stairs, high heels on boots, and the risk of a splash. One wrong move and your apron became collateral damage. Of course, most middle-class homes didn't have more than one or two servants, so the same girl who emptied the pot might also serve breakfast, answer the door and dust the drawing room. There was no specialisation. A lady's maid might have the exclusive task of tending to clothing and hair, but in more modest homes, all the mess funneled to one tired teenager in stiff shoes. Laundry was another ordeal. Underthings, especially those worn during menstruation, were washed by hand with soap flakes, soda and elbow grease. Women's drawers, chemises, corset liners, all soaked, scrubbed, rinsed and wrung out without the aid of machines. Then they had to be hung discreetly. Heaven forbid a guest glimpse a drying chemise flapping in the garden breeze. Some homes had covered drying racks, others made do with careful timing and creative curtain usage. Maids also cleaned the actual bathroom if one existed. Early indoor plumbing was fickle, and water closets had to be flushed manually, often with a chain-pull tank overhead. When the cisterns misbehaved, overflowed, gurgled, refused to refill, it was the maid who got soaked trying to fix it. When sewer gases leaked through the pipes, it was the maid who lit vinegar-soaked cloths to purify the air. When rats came up from the drain, yes, really, it was the maid who shrieked first, and then had to trap them. And it wasn't just about cleaning up. Servants were sometimes expected to assist with actual hygiene. A lady might call her maid to help unlace a corset for washing, to scrub her back with a coarse cloth, or to brush her hair each night before bed. Hairbrushing, in particular, was a daily ritual. 100 strokes was the recommendation, and many women preferred to sit while their maid performed the task. It was intimate, time-consuming, and repetitive. It also offered maids insight into everything from scalp conditions to secret bald spots. Some women spoke freely during these sessions, treating their maids as confidants. Others remained silent, maintaining strict class boundaries. Either way, the maid learned a great deal about schedules, cycles, health quirks, and family tensions, and she was expected to forget it all instantly. Historians often debate how much autonomy these maids really had. On one hand, they were essential. The lady of the house could not function, let alone appear presentable, without their assistance. On the other hand, they were still servants, subject to long hours, little pay, and near constant observation. One diary entry from a housemaid in 1884 reads, "Lady wanted new perfume rinsed through her underthings. Gave me 6pence to fetch it, then scolded me for the smell." In another letter, a governess writes that her employer expected her to train the household staff on the silent and invisible art of water service, as if fetching buckets without a splash was some kind of mystical practice. But maids were not passive. They formed their own networks, shared cleaning tips, and whispered warnings about the worst employers. They learned how to bleach linens with boiled milk and lemon, how to remove rust stains with salt and vinegar, and how to unclog a pipe using a bent spoon and a prayer. Some developed quiet pride in their skills, others plotted escape. There were hierarchies even among servants. A lady's maid ranked above a housemaid, who ranked above a scullery maid, who did the truly thankless jobs, cleaning chamber pots, scrubbing soiled rags, scouring privy seats. Many of these girls were as young as 13 or 14, working 6 or 7 days a week, often for families who barely knew their names. And yet, for all the hardships, there were moments of strange shared humanity. A mistress doubled over from menstrual cramps might snap at her maid, then ask her for help heating a brick to ease the pain. A maid, noticing a telltale stain on the bedsheets, might quietly change the linen without comment. The lines between employer and servant blurred, momentarily, under the shared reality of being women in bodies that did not ask permission to bleed, cramp, or falter. There was also an economy of secrets. Maids who kept quiet about their mistress's mishaps, whether it was a soiled corset, a fainting fit, or an embarrassing rash, often earned trust, which could mean better conditions or eventual recommendations. But the power was never equal. A single complaint from a mistress could mean dismissal, no matter how many secrets a maid had buried behind her silence. In some households, the relationship was more symbiotic. The maid might be treated almost like a younger sister or an older daughter. She might receive hand-me-downs, lessons in reading or sewing, even small gifts. But these arrangements were rare and always bound by unspoken rules. The strangest irony of all? Many maids had better hygiene than their employers. They bathed more often, if only by splashing off at the end of a grueling day, because they sweated more, worked more, and didn't wear layers of scent to mask their exertion. A scullery maid with a strong back and a clean apron might have felt fresher than the powdered, perfumed lady she worked for, at least by Friday. By the end of the century, reformers began advocating for servant rights. Shorter hours, better wages, days off. Some middle-class women, themselves frustrated by the demands of their own roles, sympathised with their maids and sought to create more equitable households. But for most of the Victorian era, the servant's role remained one of gruelling invisibility, and nowhere was this more pronounced than in the realm of hygiene. The chambermaid knew every stain, every scent, every leak and groan of the bathroom fixtures. She handled the body's detritus with her bare hands, and she did it while maintaining the illusion that the lady of the house was a fragrant, spotless being who somehow never sweated, never bled, and certainly never soiled a linen. In truth, it was the servant who upheld the myth of Victorian modesty, the hidden scaffolding of propriety. Without her, the system collapsed, and though her name rarely appeared in family portraits or society columns, her work lived in every folded towel, every clean basin, every dainty bottle of lavender oil. She was the ghost of the bathroom, and she never got to sit down. If there was one object more trusted than a chamber pot in a Victorian woman's life, it was a book. Specifically, one of the many etiquette manuals, advice guides, or conduct books that lined parlour shelves and nightstands like miniature moral sentries. These volumes were the unspoken authorities on how a woman should behave, dress, speak, and yes, even wash herself. And though many appeared harmless, stitched in linen covers and scented with rose petals, they governed every inch of a woman's life, from her bonnet ribbon to her undergarments. Victorian society prized order, and that order extended into the deeply private. If a woman had questions about menstruation, digestion, bathing frequency, or even how to rinse out a sponge, she didn't ask her mother or her doctor. She consulted a book, and there were plenty to choose from. Titles like The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility, Hints on Health and Beauty, The Art of Being a Woman, and the ever-popular Inquire Within Upon Everything lined the shelves of literate households. Some were medical, others moralistic. Most were written by men, all were presented as indispensable to the female condition. One such guide offered this crisp advice. A lady must consider her personal care not as vanity, but as respect for others. It went on to outline, in agonising detail, when to bathe, not less than once per week, what to eat, soft fruits sparingly, hard meats only with broth, and how often to brush one's hair, not less than 100 strokes per day, with downward rhythm and humble thought. What these manuals lacked in scientific accuracy, they more than made up for in certainty. There were diagrams, delicate illustrations of how to sponge bathe without exposing the body to the mirror, charts showing menstrual regularity mapped like planetary orbits, even prayers for modesty intended to be whispered while washing. One particularly popular publication, the Mother's Book of Household Grace, featured an entire chapter on the quiet hour, suggesting that young women should reserve 30 minutes each morning for prayer, brushing, foot washing, and gentle abdominal massage. This quiet care, it explained, permits the bowels to remember their duty and the mind to remain chaste. Historians still marvel at the tone of these books, so confident, so absolute. They position themselves as guardians of morality and physical health, yet often contradicted one another. One guide declared that a woman should avoid cold water entirely, lest she excite her nerves. Another insisted that cold water was the tonic of the virtuous. Still, women read them, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine fear of doing something wrong. For a Victorian girl just stepping into womanhood, there was no Google, no group chat, no school nurse. There was a book with thin pages and firm warnings. And that book, in its own prim way, might contain her only real education about her body. There were also advice columns, published in periodicals and women's magazines. Readers sent in coded questions. How often must one refresh herself in private if she's of delicate constitution? Or is it appropriate to bring one's own linen to a public bath if uncertain of their sanitation? The answers were often evasive, wrapped in metaphor, padded with scripture, and signed by women with names like Mrs. Prudence, the Gentle Aunt, or the Physician's Daughter. But read between the lines, and you'd find the true message: your body is a mystery, clean it quietly, don't talk too much. Some books strayed further into moralism. They tied hygiene directly to virtue. A clean body meant a clean soul. A woman who washed her feet daily but failed to confess her jealousy was just as soiled. The bathroom, they implied, was a battleground for the spirit. One manual put it bluntly: no lady shall be trusted who permits her limbs to be seen, by others or by herself. And yet among these pages you could sometimes find small golden glimmers of honesty. A single paragraph acknowledging the discomfort of corsets, a footnote about menstrual pain, a sidebar suggesting chamomile tea for bloating, and the female gloom. These small admissions felt like quiet rebellions, tiny cracks in the polished facade of Victorian domestic life. Of course, not all advice was welcome. Some books recommended daily douches with vinegar or borax, which we now know could cause serious harm. Others warned women not to overindulge in hair washing, lest they weaken the scalp. One particularly aggressive manual claimed that reading novels during menstruation could soften the mind and loosen the humours. And then there were the self-help systems, multi-volume guides sold door-to-door, complete with charts, lockable storage boxes and tear-out schedules. The Homekeeper's Almanac, for example, included monthly hygiene checklists divided by age and marital status. Single women were urged to wash their hair less. Married women were told to lightly scent their underthings for their husband's comfort. Widows, they were advised to bathe with spiritual moderation. Even royalty wasn't immune. Queen Victoria herself reportedly approved of certain moral hygiene guides distributed to young girls in the palace orphanages. These included stern reminders to temper bodily attentions with gratitude for one's station. It was a delicate way of saying, don't complain, and for heaven's sake, don't explore. Despite the patronising tone, many women cherished these books. They passed them down between generations, tucked them under pillows, annotated them in pencil. In them they found not just instruction, but connection. A lineage of readers trying to decode the same riddles. And some women wrote their own. Quietly, under pen names, they published booklets and essays that offered real advice. They described cloth pads for menstruation, not as ladies' aids, but as what they were. They suggested gentle laxatives for constipation, and described how to bathe an infant without scalding it. They named the parts no one else dared name. These voices were few, but they mattered. They offered truth in a sea of euphemism. And for the woman struggling in silence, clutching her guidebook, kneeling beside her wash basin, they may have been the only comfort. There's something almost tender in that image. A woman alone in her room, hair unbraided, corset off, reading by candlelight the words of someone who understood. Who said, "You're not wrong to wonder. You're not impure for needing answers. You're not alone." Today these books seem absurd, quaint at best, oppressive at worst. But in their pages lies the blueprint of a world where silence was the law and modesty a performance. Where knowing too much was dangerous, and knowing too little was a lifelong sentence. And yet, Victorian women read. They questioned, they shared, they underlined. In the bathroom behind the screen, with the pot hidden and the washcloth ready, they made space for knowledge, quietly, carefully, as always. Picture this: a Victorian woman, corset laced, bonnet pinned, parasol in hand, about to embark on a journey. It might be a short train ride to visit a cousin, or a day trip to the coast, or a longer carriage route across counties. Her luggage is packed. Modest gowns, gloves, perhaps a fainting fan, but one critical concern lingers behind her polite smile. How exactly is she going to manage her bodily needs along the way? For all its romanticised elegance, Victorian travel was rife with practical difficulties, especially for women. Unlike today's stations with clearly marked restrooms and wet wipes at the ready, the mid-19th century landscape offered very little in the way of accessible or private facilities. The question of how Victorian women relieved themselves while en route, particularly during long journeys, was one of the era's most whispered logistical puzzles. Start with train travel. By the 1850s and 60s, the expanding railway network made it possible for women to cross long distances in a fraction of the time it once took. Trains were modern, fast, and, if you were lucky, somewhat comfortable. But bathrooms, not part of the early design. Most early train carriages had no toilet facilities whatsoever. Passengers were expected to manage their needs before departure and hold on until arrival, regardless of delays or biological urgency. For men, this was merely inconvenient. For women, layered in petticoats and laced up tightly, it was a nightmare. A 2-hour delay could mean physical pain. A longer trip could involve desperation and improvisation. Some rail stations offered public toilets, but these were rare and often unsanitary. Ladies' retiring rooms, when they existed, were dim, cold, and far from comforting. One traveller described a station facility as a tiled closet with a door that would not shut, and a stench that bid one run. And so Victorian women became masters of travel restraint. Many ate lightly before journeys, sipping only small amounts of tea and avoided rich or fibrous foods that might stir the digestive tract. There are accounts of women declining even sips of water before long rides, preferring mild dehydration to the risk of an awkward situation miles from the next stop. Some women brought chamber pots, disguised, of course. The travelling pot or lady's convenience came in clever designs, ceramic vessels shaped like handbags or flat-bottomed urinals that could slide under a skirt while seated. One version, called the sanitary slipper, was designed to mimic a shoe, allowing the wearer to position it discreetly while sitting, then carry it away wrapped in a cloth. Ingenious, yes. Comfortable, not remotely. Carriage travel posed similar challenges. Journeys across bumpy roads could last for hours, and stops were dictated by the driver's whim or the terrain, not by need. Inns or coaching stations might have privies, but they were often shared, filthy, or in disrepair. A woman travelling with a chaperone might ask to stretch her legs, walking just far enough into a thicket to find privacy. A well-placed bush, a shawl, and a lady's maid standing guard became the impromptu restroom strategy of many a desperate gentlewoman. Of course, this raised questions of class. Wealthy women had more options, private carriages, personal maids, better luggage in which to conceal supplies. A maid could carry cloths, water, fresh chemises, even a collapsible basin. Middle-class women had to be more resourceful, sometimes hiding their own supplies in false-bottomed trunks or sewing emergency cloths into skirt linings. And working-class women? They endured. Their travel was usually limited to necessity, moving for work, visiting family, or market trips. They often had no privacy, no escort, and no illusions about the messier aspects of the road. Some brought rags to use as makeshift sanitary cloths. Others used nature as best they could, finding privacy where no one else looked, behind hedgerows, in alleyways, or in the shadows of buildings. For them, modesty was not always an option. Survival came first. Ships presented another conundrum. Onboard lavatories, called heads, were rudimentary at best. For women, access to a private facility could mean squeezing past the crew, down slick steps, to a cramped closet that emptied directly into the sea. Seasickness only added to the horror. Wealthier passengers fared better, with cabins equipped with chamber pots or in luxury liners, actual flushing toilets. But even then, the experience was far from elegant, and so many women avoided travel entirely unless necessary. The risks of embarrassment, illness, or discomfort were simply too high. But for those who ventured out, careful planning became second nature. Clothing played a role in this. Many women wore split-crotch drawers or adopted looser underclothes while travelling. This allowed for quicker manoeuvring, whether using a chamber pot in a train carriage or slipping behind a hedgerow. Skirts provided privacy, especially with a well-placed bustle or petticoat to drape strategically. Gloves, fans and shawls were used not just for warmth or style, but to distract, obscure, and provide plausible cover for a disappearing act. Some carried scent sachets, both to counter smells and to mask their own. A quick dab of rosewater, a clove-stuffed handkerchief, and one could pretend that everything was fresh, even when the truth was more pungent. There were also social rituals. One never mentioned the need to go. Instead, women excused themselves with phrases like, "I must find my embroidery," or "I'll just take some air." A well-trained companion understood immediately. If the trip was long, the chaperone might coordinate subtle bathroom stops, arranging breaks at known inns, or giving a coded signal to pause the carriage. Historians debate how much these routines were known and understood by men. Some argue that gentlemen remained blissfully unaware, protected by layers of propriety and silence. Others suggest they knew quite well but played along with the charade. One male traveller wrote, "The ladies took their walk to the trees with admirable coordination, and reappeared with cheeks freshened by the breeze. I did not ask questions." Still, the strain took its toll. Women wrote letters describing the agony of restraint, the fear of being caught unready, the discomfort of suppressing natural needs for hours, and the constant threat of accidents, a word never used, only implied. One particularly heart-wrenching diary entry from 1863 recounts a train delay that stretched into the night. "We sat, unmoved, for nearly 5 hours. I dared not ask. I wept quietly into my gloves. That's not just discomfort, that's endurance. And yet, in their quiet resilience, these women became masters of adaptation. They developed travel kits with cloths, lavender oil and vinegar. They learned which stations had proper facilities. They made notes, asked other women in whispers, and shared the knowledge carefully. They knew which inns offered privacy, which train compartments allowed for a quick adjustment of underclothes, and how to signal a maid without words. It was a dance, part strategy, part silence, all necessity. Even literature of the time reflects this tension. Female characters in novels rarely had bodily needs, and if they did, it was conveyed through fainting, illness, or vague mentions of fatigue. But behind the scenes, readers knew. They had lived it. Travel, so romantic in paintings and prose, was, for Victorian women, a balancing act of bladder, bowels, and decorum, and yet they did it. They travelled to weddings, funerals, holidays, and courtships. They crossed oceans, visited spas, and even explored ruins in Egypt, all while carrying their chamber pots in decorative cases and pretending they hadn't just used a bush in their bonnet. Because in the end, movement mattered. Travel was freedom, even when uncomfortable, and Victorian women, trapped in layers, limited by modesty, found ways to keep moving, one foot after another, one hedge at a time. By the end of the 19th century, the air in Victorian homes began to shift, literally and figuratively. Pipes clanged, taps dripped, and for the first time water moved indoors with purpose. Plumbing, that humble yet revolutionary innovation, was slowly unseating the chamber pot, the pitcher and basin, and the perfume-drenched rituals of bathroom secrecy. The Victorian bathroom, once a private theatre of restraint, was evolving into something surprisingly modern, and with it, the women who had quietly upheld its rules were preparing to let a few of them go. It didn't happen all at once. In the earliest years, indoor plumbing was considered a luxury, a novelty for the wealthy and a curiosity for everyone else. Those who could afford it installed water closets in upper-floor dressing rooms complete with pool chains, marble basins and porcelain bowls. These fixtures were not hidden away. They were displayed like status symbols. An 1885 ad for one such toilet proudly called it a hygienic marvel and centrepiece of civilised domesticity. Quite the leap from a chamber pot under the bed. But for most homes, especially in rural areas, indoor plumbing was still decades away. That didn't stop the conversation from changing. Public health campaigns began urging people to see cleanliness not just as personal virtue, but civic responsibility. Filth, once masked with rosewater and silence, was now framed as a public threat, linked to cholera outbreaks, typhus, and the ominously named miasma. Municipalities responded by installing sewage systems and building public bathhouses. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames overflowed with human waste and the smell was so bad Parliament debated in soaked rags, pushed the government into action. The resulting sewer system, led by Joseph Bazalgette, became a model for other cities. The message was clear: water must move, and with it, the old ways must recede. For Victorian women, this shift was both freeing and disorienting. The bathroom was no longer a makeshift space hidden behind screens or folded into the bedroom. It was becoming a designated room with walls, plumbing, and, shockingly, locks. And with this architectural clarity came a loosening of the behavioural reins. Suddenly one could wash in privacy, without maids or whispered euphemisms. One could flush away evidence rather than carry it. For women who had spent a lifetime managing modesty like a military operation, this was a profound change. The routines didn't disappear overnight, but they softened. The air smelled less of rose oil and more of carbolic soap. Scented waters were joined by actual water, hot, running, and just a twist of the tap away. Toothbrushing, for example, became simpler. Toothpaste replaced powder in many homes, sold in tubes inspired by paint containers. Brands like Colgate and Euthymol gained popularity, and women began to view oral care less as a social necessity and more as a personal standard. Hair care, too, benefited. Indoor plumbing made it easier to wash, rinse and dry one's locks without needing a half day and 2 buckets. Even menstruation, long shrouded in euphemism and anxiety, began its own subtle transformation. Ads for commercial menstrual pads, then called sanitary napkins, appeared in women's magazines, urging readers to step forward into modern ease. While still bulky and primitive by today's standards, these products represented something radical. The idea that a woman's cycle was not a shameful burden, but a manageable fact of life. Historians still argue how liberating this period truly was. Certainly societal pressures didn't vanish. Women were still expected to be modest, delicate and quiet about their bodily functions. But the bathroom itself, once a performance of poise and denial, was becoming a site of practicality. The focus shifted from hiding to managing, from moral virtue to physical well-being. Advice books evolved in turn. The rigid moral guides gave way to household manuals with more practical tips. Recipes for soap, vinegar cleaning solutions and herbal rinses were printed alongside knitting patterns and childcare advice. Medical journals, now accessible to middle-class readers, provided more accurate health information, and the veil over women's bodies began to lift, if only slightly. There were, of course, generational tensions. Older women clung to the old rituals, suspicious of flush toilets and sceptical of daily bathing. One matron famously declared that daily washing stripped the skin of its God-given oils. Younger women, by contrast, embraced the changes, delighting in the freedom to wash at will, to lock a door, to rinse without supervision. Magazines featured glossy bathroom spreads, tiles, faucets, slipper tubs, all gleaming with modern promise. Plumbing companies advertised not just hygiene, but elegance. A bathroom wasn't merely a utility, it was a reflection of taste. She who tends her home, one had cooed, tends her soul. Yet the most meaningful change wasn't ceramic or chrome, it was psychological. As bathrooms became physical rooms, bodily maintenance became less abstract. No longer did one need to retire to refresh, or quiet herself with linens. Now one could simply say, "Excuse me," and step into a room designed for care. This shift rippled beyond the home. Department stores added women's lounges, complete with toilets and powder rooms. Train stations began to feature dedicated ladies' facilities, often staffed by attendants of refinement. Even some workplaces installed restrooms. Though often segregated and poorly maintained, they still marked a new public acknowledgement. Women have bodies, and those bodies have needs. Of course, not all embraced these changes. Critics warned of moral decay, of over-cleanliness leading to vanity, of flushing toilets breaking down social hierarchies. Too much ease, one reverend cautioned, and a woman forgets her station. But the tide could not be reversed. The bathroom had come into the light. By the turn of the century, etiquette books reflected this new reality. While modesty was still encouraged, it was now framed as practical, not mystical. A woman should bathe regularly to avoid illness, brush her teeth to preserve health, and speak plainly when seeking facilities. The idea that the body was inherently shameful began to fade, replaced by the notion that it simply required care. And with that, the Victorian bathroom, lavender-scented, basin-laden, chamber pot-equipped, began its final curtain call. Its drama, its mystery, its whispered codes gave way to tile floors, brass fittings and running water. The rituals of concealment were not lost exactly. They just evolved. Where once a lady hid her menstrual cloths in embroidered pouches, she now folded a box of pads into her handbag. Where once she kept her toothbrush in a velvet case beneath the washstand, she now left it by the sink. The veil was thinning, not torn, but enough to change how women saw themselves. Because in the end, the bathroom had never really been about hygiene alone. It had been a mirror, reflecting society's expectations, anxieties, and aspirations. And as plumbing roared to life, it carried away more than waste. It washed away silence. It carried off shame. And it left behind, in its porcelain wake, something almost revolutionary: space, private space, clean space, chosen space. A room with a door that closed. And now, gentle listener, we've reached the end of our journey, through chamber pots and lavender sachets, through whispered euphemisms and marble-topped washstands, through the rituals, secrets, and ingenuity of Victorian women and their most personal routines. It's been a quiet kind of odyssey, hasn't it? Let's slow our breath now, like the last trace of steam rising from a teacup. Imagine the hush of a quiet room lit by candlelight, the faint rustle of a petticoat being folded, the soothing scrape of a hairbrush through long, tired strands. The Victorian bathroom may have been a place of complexity and contradiction, but it was also, at its heart, a place of care. Often invisible, often unspoken, but always present. And behind every basin, behind every folded towel and perfumed bottle, stood women doing their best with what they had, managing discomfort, guarding dignity, claiming a sliver of peace in a world that demanded grace without granting ease. So as you drift off tonight, remember those quiet caretakers of the past, the ones who carried rosewater in their pockets and lavender in their drawers, the ones who turned modesty into ritual, who learned resilience in silence, and who, one lock at a time, taught the world how to give them space. Sleep gently now.